Hey there, welcome to Broaderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The spirit of the old coral. Have you ever felt the weight of silence pressing on you as though the air itself was watching? It's the kind of quiet that clings to your skin, cold and unnerving, the kind that makes your heart stutter for no reason at all. Why is it that certain places, even though empty for years, seem to whisper with unseen eyes? That's the question that circled in my mind the moment I first saw the old ship, drifting silently in the mist like a ghost, forgotten at the abandoned dock. I wasn't supposed to be there, but curiosity has a way of leading people to places they wish they'd never discovered. I had heard stories about the ship, but they always seemed like the kind of thing locals whispered to spook outsiders. No one really knew its name anymore. It had long faded from the rusted metal of the hull. It was just there. An abandoned relic, tucked away in a forgotten corner of the bay, where even the sea seemed reluctant to stir. I wasn't alone when I first saw it. A group of us, a few friends and myself, were wandering near the old dock. It was one of those late summer evenings where the heat of the day lingered just enough to feel uncomfortable, and the horizon was swallowed by a thick, rolling fog. My friend Daniel had been the one to suggest we explore it. He had a knack for finding trouble and was always drawn to places with history, as he liked to put it. But there was something different about the way he looked at the ship, almost like he wasn't entirely convinced of his own bravado. "We could check it out," Daniel said with a half smile, his voice echoing slightly off the wooden posts of the dock. "I mean, what's the worst that could happen?" I shot him a glance, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. "A lot of things, probably," I replied, my eyes never leaving the looming figure of the ship. Even from a distance, it looked wrong. The kind of wrong that you can't explain, but feel deep inside your bones. Like it was watching us, waiting for someone to make the first move. But of course, none of us said that out loud. Instead, we laughed, shrugged it off, and made our way towards the gangplank, which groaned under our weight as though it hadn't been touched in years. Each step felt heavier than the last. The wood creaked beneath my shoes, and I had the honest sensation that the ship was waking up, as if it could feel us. Once we stepped aboard, the air changed. The wind, which had been softly blowing moments before, died down completely. Everything became still, like the world was holding its breath. I hadn't realized it until then, but the sound of the ocean, the distant cries of gulls, had all faded. The silence was suffocating. "Creepy," Daniel muttered under his breath, breaking the uneasy stillness. He had his phone out, the flashlight app glowing dimly as he swung it around, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. The ship was massive, larger than I had expected. It was clear that this was no simple fishing vessel. It had been a cargo ship of some kind, though what it had once carried was long forgotten. The decks were strewn with rusted chains and empty crates, all covered in a thick layer of dust. The place looked frozen in time, as though its crew had simply vanished without a trace. It didn't take long before the feeling of being watched grew unbearable. I could feel it now, stronger than ever, eyes boring into the back of my neck. I turned sharply, but there was nothing. Just the empty expanse of the ship behind us. And yet, I knew something was there. We made our way deeper into the ship, despite the gnawing fear that tugged at my gut, urging me to leave. But there was something about the place, something that held us captive in its eerie grip. It wasn't just the ship, it was something else, something older, something waiting. It was Daniel who first noticed the door. It was tucked away near the far end of the deck, half hidden behind a tangle of old ropes. It was different from the other doors we'd seen. This one was made of dark, polished wood, untouched by the rust and decay that had consumed the rest of the ship. "Let's check it out," Daniel said, his voice a mix of excitement and unease. He reached for the handle, and for a moment, I almost told him to stop. But the words caught in my throat. I didn't know why, but it felt like crossing a line, like opening that door would change everything. He pulled it open with a low groan, and the smell hit us first, a damp, musty scent, like something old and rotting. Inside was a narrow staircase leading down into the belly of the ship. The walls were lined with old lanterns, most of them cracked and shattered, their glass reflecting our dim lights in jagged fragments. As we descended, the air grew colder. My breath puffed in front of me, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were going deeper than we should, like we were sinking into something we weren't meant to find. At the bottom of the stairs was a small cabin, its door slightly ajar. There was something unsettling about how undisturbed it looked. The furniture was still intact, a small wooden table, a few chairs, and in the corner, an old iron bed. But what caught my eye was the journal on the table, its pages yellowed with age. Daniel picked it up, flipping through the pages. His face paled as he read the words aloud, though his voice wavered with uncertainty. Captain's log. Day 85. The crew has started seeing things. Shadows that move where there should be none. I can feel them too, watching us. I've locked myself in my cabin. I don't think they're human anymore. I felt the cold grip of dread twist inside me. Daniel closed the journal, his face drained of all color. "That's enough," I said, my voice hoarse. "We need to leave." But as I turned to head back up the stairs, the door to the cabin slammed shut with a deafening bang. And that's when we heard it, the slow, deliberate footsteps above us, pacing the deck. The footsteps above us echoed like a heartbeat, a slow and steady rhythm that sent chills racing down my spine. My heart pounded against my rib cage, each beat a desperate reminder of how trapped we truly were. I glanced at Daniel, who stood frozen, his eyes wide with disbelief. It was as if the air had been sucked from the room, leaving only a suffocating silence in its wake. "What was that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I opened my mouth to reply, but the words caught in my throat. What could I say? That we were trapped in a ship haunted by a ghost? I felt a wave of panic wash over me, and instinctively, I reached for the doorknob, turning it with trembling hands. To my relief, it opened easily, revealing the staircase we had descended. "Let's get out of here," I urged, glancing over my shoulder as the footsteps continued their ominous march above us. With each step, the ship creaked and groaned as if protesting our presence. Daniel followed closely behind, his flashlight beam darting nervously across the walls. We climbed the stairs two at a time, desperate to escape whatever presence lurked above. As we reached the deck, I was met with a scene that sent a fresh wave of dread coursing through me. The fog had thickened, enveloping the ship like a shroud. It curled around the masts and drifted across the deck, swallowing the edges of our light. I scanned the horizon, but all I could see was a swirling gray void. The footsteps had stopped, replaced by an unsettling stillness that wrapped around us like a vice. Where did everyone go? Daniel muttered, glancing around as if expecting to see the rest of our friends. They're probably still on the dock, I replied, but I felt a gnawing doubt. We hadn't been gone that long, had we? Let's just get back to the dock. Now. As we made our way back to the gangplank, I could feel a weight in the air, a presence that seemed to press against my chest. I was acutely aware of the shadows creeping in the corners of my vision, flickering just beyond the beam of Daniel's flashlight. I turned quickly, but nothing was there. Just the ship, dark and brooding. Halfway to the gangplank, Daniel suddenly stopped. His face was pale, and I could see the realization dawning in his eyes. Wait, where's the other guys? My heart sank. I hadn't thought about them since we stepped aboard. They must be waiting for us. Maybe they went exploring somewhere else? Or maybe Daniel's voice trailed off, a flicker of fear passing over his face. Maybe they felt something was off too and left. My stomach dropped. The thought of being alone on this ship, with no one else around, sent a wave of nausea through me. We need to call them. Get off this ship. I pulled out my phone, but the screen remained stubbornly dark. The signal was gone. Great, I muttered, shoving it back into my pocket. Let's just keep moving. As we approached the gangplank, I heard something, a soft whisper carried on the wind. It was indistinct, but it felt like a call. Help me, it was a voice, gentle and pleading, yet laced with an undercurrent of despair. Did you hear that? I asked, glancing at Daniel. He looked as if he had just seen a ghost. Hear what? He replied, his voice low and shaky. Someone's on this ship, I said, feeling a mix of fear and determination. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was calling out was in distress. We have to find them. Are you crazy? Daniel exclaimed, but something in his eyes suggested he was intrigued, drawn in by the mystery as much as I was. What if it's a trap? Then we'll run. But we can't just leave someone here. My voice held a steadiness I didn't quite feel, but I pushed through, my resolve hardening. Against his better judgment, Daniel nodded. Okay, but let's stick together. We turned back toward the interior of the ship, the darkness swallowing us once again. I felt the oppressive weight of the atmosphere closing in around us, each step echoing with uncertainty. The whispers grew louder, becoming a cacophony of desperate pleas that reverberated through the ship. Help me, help me. The voice drew me toward the cabin we had just left. Something compelled me to follow it, the promise of salvation or perhaps something far more sinister. As we approached the door, I hesitated. Was this the right choice? Every instinct in me screamed to turn back. Do you really think someone is in there? Daniel asked, glancing back at me with uncertainty. I nodded, though doubt crept into my mind. The whispers were clearer now, more urgent. We need to find out. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open, the hinges protesting with a shriek. The cabin was dim, but the light from Daniel's phone illuminated the journal lying on the table, its pages flipping as if disturbed by an unseen hand. Look! I exclaimed, pointing to the pages. The words seemed to writhe on the paper, rearranging themselves into an urgent message, get out before it wakes. I felt a chill run through me. What did that mean? Before I could ponder it further, a cold gust of wind blew through the cabin, extinguishing Daniel's light and plunging us into darkness. Panic surged as I fumbled for my phone, but it remained dead in my pocket. Then, I heard it. A low growl rumbling from somewhere deep within the ship. It resonated in my bones, primal and ancient. Something's not right, Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't disagree. But even as fear clawed at my insides, curiosity pulled me forward. We can't leave now. We have to figure this out. Suddenly, the temperature dropped sharply, and the shadows in the corners of the room began to twist and warp, coalescing into a shape. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And then it emerged, a figure, tall and cloaked, its features obscured by the darkness. "Leave," it hissed, its voice echoing with 1,000 unfulfilled dreams, an urgency that sent a shiver of fear through me. "You must leave." And just as quickly as it appeared, the figure vanished, leaving behind an unsettling silence. My heart raced as I turned to Daniel, whose eyes were wide with shock. "We have to get out of here," I urged, my voice trembling. "Now." But as we made our way back to the deck, I felt a profound sense of dread wash over me. Whatever that figure was, it didn't want us here. And as the weight of that realization sank in, I knew we were only beginning to uncover the horrors that lay hidden within the shadows of the old ship. We raced back through the ship, each step echoing with urgency and fear. The darkness felt alive, wrapping around us like a thick fog, but we pressed on, driven by the primal instinct to survive. The whispers returned, rising to a fever pitch, a chorus of voices warning us, pleading for release. "Get out," they cried in unison, a haunting melody that sent chills racing up my spine. "Get out before it wakes." I could feel the panic rising in my chest, tightening like a vice. Daniel was just a few steps behind me, his breaths coming in quick, shallow gasps. "Where are the others?" he asked, glancing around as though expecting to find our friends lurking in the shadows. "I don't know," I shouted back, the frustration bubbling to the surface. "We have to focus on getting out of here." As we reached the deck, a sudden movement caught my eye. A figure stood at the edge of the ship, partially obscured by the thick fog. My heart leaped into my throat. "There!" I pointed, my voice trembling with both fear and hope. "Maybe it's one of them." But as we drew closer, the figure turned, and I felt a wave of recognition wash over me. It was Lisa, one of our friends, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with terror. "Thank God!" I exclaimed, rushing towards her. "Where's everyone else? What happened?" Lisa took a step back, her expression haunted. They're gone," she whispered, her voice shaking. I heard the whispers too, and then I lost them. They just vanished. Daniel shook his head, a look of disbelief crossing his face. "What do you mean vanished? How is that even possible?" "I don't know," Lisa cried, her hands trembling. I just felt this pull, like something was dragging me down into the ship. I couldn't find them. Panic surged within me. "We can't stay here. We need to find them, now." But before we could move, the air around us grew thick with an oppressive energy, as though the ship itself was awakening from a long slumber. The whispers intensified, echoing off the walls, drowning our thoughts. "Leave! Leave!" they cried, a desperate plea that made my skin crawl. "Something's wrong," Lisa said, her eyes darting around nervously. "We shouldn't be here. We can't just leave without them." I insisted, my heart pounding against my ribs. They could be in danger. Suddenly, the ship shuddered violently, sending us stumbling. I grabbed the railing to steady myself as a low rumble reverberated beneath our feet, like a growl from the depths of the ocean. "We have to go now," Daniel shouted over the cacophony of whispers, his voice tinged with fear. "Whatever is happening, it's not safe." Reluctantly, I nodded. "Okay, we'll head to the dock and call for help." but we need to make sure we look for the others on the way. With Lisa and Daniel at my side, we hurried towards the gangplank. Each step felt heavy, as though the ship was resisting our departure. I glanced back, half expecting to see our friends materializing from the shadows, but there was only the echoing silence. As we reached the gangplank, I hesitated. Should we call out for them? I suggested, my voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Daniel urged. Maybe they can hear us. Hey, guys, I shouted, my voice piercing the heavy air. If you're there, respond. We're coming for you. But there was no answer, only the continued whispering that wrapped around us like a shroud. I felt my heart sink further as dread pooled in my stomach. It was as if the ship itself was alive, aware of our presence, and determined to keep us there. Just as we stepped onto the gangplank, I felt a sudden chill wash over me. My breath misted in the cold air, and I turned to look back at the ship, drawn by an inexplicable force. Something is wrong, Lisa murmured, her voice trembling. We shouldn't be here. We have to leave now. But it was too late. A figure emerged from the shadows of the ship, tall and cloaked, its features obscured by the darkness. The whispers quieted, replaced by a singular voice that resonated in my mind. Leave, now, before it awakens, it hissed, the words seeping into my bones. I felt an icy grip around my heart as I stared into the void where its face should have been. What do you want? I called out, my voice wavering. What happened to our friends? The figure tilted its head, and the air seemed to thrum with tension. They have been taken, it whispered. You must leave, or you will join them in eternal slumber. The warning hung heavy in the air, and I felt the ground beneath me tremble. Panic surged within me. We can't leave them. I shouted, desperation rising in my throat. Foolish child, the figure intoned, its voice echoing with a depth of sorrow. The ship demands a sacrifice. It will not let you go until it has what it desires. In that moment, I felt it, the ship's presence, a dark and ancient force that wrapped around us like a vice. My heart raced as I realized the truth. We were not merely lost, we were trapped, ensnared by something far beyond our understanding. We have to run. Daniel shouted, breaking the spell that held us captive. He grabbed my arm, pulling me towards the dock. But before we could take a step, the ship trembled violently again, the sound of wood splintering filling the air. I looked back just in time to see the figure dissolve into the fog, leaving behind an overwhelming sense of dread. We can't stay. I cried, the urgency in my voice cutting through the fear that gripped us. We have to get off this ship. We ran towards the dock, the gangplank swaying beneath us. As we reached the edge, I turned back for one last glance at the ship, my heart heavy with uncertainty. And then I saw it, a flicker of movement in the shadows. A figure stepped forward, silhouetted against the fog. It was one of our friends. Help, they shouted, their voice filled with panic. Please, help us. Without thinking, I lunged forward, my heart racing. We're coming. I shouted, but as I reached for the figure, the ship trembled again, a low growl emanating from its depths. Leave, the voice echoed, now mingling with the whispers. Leave while you can. I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder, and I turned to find Daniel and Lisa beside me, their eyes wide with terror. We can't go back. Daniel shouted, his voice filled with fear. Whatever is on that ship wants us. But I couldn't just leave. I couldn't abandon our friend. We have to help them. I insisted, my heart pounding with urgency. No, Lisa cried, panic rising in her voice. We need to leave now. It's not safe. The figure in the shadows beckoned, and I felt a pull towards them, an inexplicable urge to reach out and grasp their hand. But as I stepped closer, the whispers intensified, drowning out my thoughts. Get out! Get out! They screamed, their voices a chaotic symphony of dread. In that moment, I realized we were caught in a web of fate, the ship feeding off our fear and confusion. The presence was alive, and it wanted us. I hesitated, torn between the desperate call of my friend and the overwhelming dread emanating from the ship. We can't leave them, I cried, my heart breaking as I glanced back at the shadows. We can't just abandon them. But the whispers surged, a tide of terror crashing against my resolve. Leave, they cried, the words merging into a single, deafening roar. In that moment, clarity struck. The ship was not merely a vessel, it was a predator, feasting on the fear of those who dared to tread its decks. Run! I shouted, feeling the weight of my decision. I turned away from the figure, knowing deep down that some things were better left undisturbed. We sprinted towards the dock, the gangplank swaying violently beneath us. The air grew thick with an unnatural energy, but I forced myself to focus on the path ahead, determined to escape the grasp of the ship and the shadows that lingered within. As we reached the end of the gangplank, I glanced back one last time. The figure was gone, swallowed by the fog, and the whispers faded into a haunting echo. But I knew we had escaped something sinister, something that wanted to keep us forever trapped. Let's go, I urged, my voice hoarse from fear. We need to get away from here. We rushed down the dock, the old wooden planks creaking beneath our hurried steps. The air felt lighter, the weight of the ship's presence lifting as we put distance between ourselves and that forsaken place. But as we reached the shore, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Something had been awakened. The moment our feet touched the solid ground of the shore, I felt a mix of relief and dread wash over me. The oppressive weight of the ship's presence lifted, but the whispers still echoed in my mind, haunting and persistent. I glanced back at the dock, half expecting to see our friends emerging from the fog, but there was only silence. We made it, Daniel said, his voice trembling. But what about Lisa? Where's she? I turned to him, my heart sinking. I thought she was right behind us. Panic surged within me. Lisa! I shouted, my voice breaking the stillness. Where are you? Please, don't, Daniel said, grabbing my arm. We can't go back. We just escaped, we have to keep moving. But I couldn't shake the gnawing fear that something terrible had happened to her. She was right there. We can't just leave her. Daniel's grip tightened on my arm. We have to think rationally. If we go back, we could end up like our friends. Whatever that thing was, it's not done with us yet. As much as I hated to admit it, he was right. The dread I felt was all-consuming. The realization that we were not alone washed over me, and it chilled me to the bone. I stepped back, staring at the ship, its shadowy form looming over the water, a dark silhouette against the mist. We have to get to town, Daniel urged. We can call for help, gather a group, and come back. Fine, I relented, my voice barely above a whisper. But we can't leave without finding Lisa. Agreed, Daniel said, glancing back at the ship as if expecting it to come alive once more. But we need to move quickly. We started down the beach, the soft sand giving way beneath our hurried steps. The atmosphere was heavy with uncertainty, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The further we moved from the ship, the more the echoes of its whispers faded, but they lingered like a shadow at the edge of my consciousness. As we approached the nearest road, the darkness of the night settled in, wrapping around us like a cloak. I could barely see the outlines of the trees that lined the path, their branches swaying ominously in the wind. A sense of unease gnawed at me. It was as if the shadows themselves were alive, watching and waiting. "Do you think they'll believe us?" I asked, breaking the silence. "That we saw, whatever that was?" "I don't know," Daniel replied, running a hand through his hair. "But we have to try. We need to warn them about the ship." Just then, we heard a rustling behind us, and both of us froze. My heart raced as I turned to look. Was it the wind or something else? I strained my ears, trying to discern the sound. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Before Daniel could respond, a figure emerged from the shadows, stumbling towards us. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was Lisa. Her clothes were disheveled, and her face was pale, a look of terror etched across her features. "Lisa!" I exclaimed, rushing to her side. "We thought you were—" "Get away from me," she shrieked, stumbling backward. Her eyes were wide with fear, darting around as if expecting something to pounce from the darkness. "What's wrong?" I asked, my heart sinking. "What happened?" "I saw it," she gasped, trembling uncontrollably. "I saw them. The shadows, they were reaching for me. I barely got away." "Shadows?" Daniel echoed, confusion etched on his face. "What do you mean?" "They weren't just shadows," Lisa said, her voice shaking. "They were alive. They wanted me. I could feel their hands on me, pulling me back. I felt a chill run down my spine." "We have to leave," I said, urgency creeping into my voice. "We can't let it take us too." "I tried to find you," Lisa continued, her voice breaking. "But I couldn't hear anything. The whispers, they were too loud. I thought I was going to die." "We're here now," I reassured her, though doubt gnawed at my insides. "Let's get to town. We need to warn everyone about the ship before it's too late." As we started down the path again, the air felt electric, charged with an unnameable energy. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes upon us, and every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. "Do you think the others are okay?" Lisa asked, glancing over her shoulder nervously. "I don't know," I admitted, guilt gnawing at me. "But we can't give up hope." Suddenly, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. I felt a cold shiver run through me as a voice whispered through the gusts, indistinct but eerily familiar. "Come back, come back." "Did you hear that?" Daniel asked, his eyes wide with fear. "Yes," I shouted, panic bubbling to the surface. "It's calling us. We need to move faster." We hurried down the road, the whispering wind chasing us, but with every step, I could feel the presence of the ship behind us, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the moment to strike. As we reached the outskirts of town, the lights from the nearby houses flickered like distant stars, promising safety. But I knew that whatever had awakened on that ship would not be so easily deterred. "Let's find someone who can help," I said, determination flooding my veins. "We have to tell them about the ship, about the shadows." We hurried to the nearest house, knocking frantically on the door. A man in his 50s opened it, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What's going on?" he asked, concern etched on his face. Please. You have to help us. I pleaded, my heart racing. There's a ship out on the dock, and it's not right. We saw something. But before I could finish, the man's expression shifted. He glanced past us, his eyes widening in fear. What is it? I asked, feeling a cold dread settle in my stomach. The wind howled again, and the whispers returned, echoing through the night. Come back, come back. The man shook his head, his face pale. You shouldn't have gone there. It's cursed. You need to leave this town, now. Panic surged through me as the realization dawned. We had unknowingly crossed into a realm of darkness, one that had been waiting for us to stumble into its grasp. Wait! Daniel shouted, desperation seeping into his voice. What do you mean cursed? But the man slammed the door shut, leaving us standing in the dark. I felt the ground beneath me tremble, and I could hear the whispers growing louder, echoing in my mind. We have to go, I urged, fear tightening its grip around my heart. If it wants us, we need to find a way to escape. As we turned to run, I glanced back at the man's house. I could see him peering out the window, his face a mask of terror. Get away from the ship, he screamed, his voice shaking. It won't let you leave. But it was too late. The shadows began to swirl around us, dark tendrils creeping closer, reaching out for our souls. Run! I screamed, my voice filled with desperation as we sprinted down the street, the whispers closing in around us. The shadows pursued us, and I could feel their cold breath against my skin, threatening to drag us back into the darkness. Just when I thought we would be consumed, we burst into the open, the moonlight spilling over us like a protective shield. I glanced back at the ship in the distance, its silhouette ominous against the night sky. We had escaped for now, but the presence of the ship lingered in my mind, a reminder that some horrors can never truly be left behind. As we fled into the night, I knew one thing for certain: whatever haunted that ship would never stop pursuing us. The inhabitants of the city. Have you ever walked through your city and wondered what truly lies beneath your feet? I used to think of the underground as nothing more than a network of old pipes and forgotten tunnels, remnants of a time long past. But sometimes, things long buried aren't forgotten at all. They're just waiting. It all started with a sinkhole. A small one at first, just outside my apartment building on 5th Street. People gathered around, curious but not alarmed. It was the kind of thing you'd expect in a city, wear and tear, weather, the usual excuses. The city workers came, put up cones, and went about their business, filling it with gravel like it was a trivial thing. But I couldn't shake it. Something about that sinkhole bothered me. I walked by it every day, and each time it seemed a little wider, a little deeper. People stopped noticing, but I couldn't look away. One evening, after coming back from work, I saw the cones had been pushed aside. The gravel was scattered, and the hole was larger than ever. No workers, no curious bystanders, just an ominous void. Something drew me toward it, and before I knew it, I was standing at the edge, peering down into the dark. That's when I saw it, something moving deep within the shadows. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a stray reflection from the street lamp above, but it wasn't. There was movement, deliberate and slow. Shapes, not quite human, but close enough to set every nerve in my body on edge. I stepped back, heart racing, and hurried inside, telling myself I'd imagined it. But that night, I couldn't sleep. The image of those shapes moving in the depths of the earth haunted me, pulling at my thoughts like claws raking over stone. The next morning, I was back at the sinkhole. This time, it was even bigger, wide enough to see the gaping darkness below. The city had sent no workers, and the street was quiet. It was as if no one cared anymore, like the hole had become invisible to everyone but me. I crouched down, my pulse pounding in my ears, and peered into the abyss. The shadows seemed deeper than they should be. The air around the hole was cooler, almost damp, like standing at the mouth of a cave. Then I saw it again, those shapes. They moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, like creatures accustomed to the dark. My breath caught in my throat as I realized they weren't just random movements. They were following a path, a pattern, as though they knew exactly where they were going. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted, a low rumble echoing from below. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. The sinkhole was expanding. Slowly, relentlessly, as if something below was trying to come up, to reach the surface. That night, I couldn't stay in my apartment. I left, wandering the city, my mind filled with questions. What was under the ground? Who, or what, were those figures I had seen? I didn't believe in the supernatural, at least not until that moment, but the rational explanations slipped further away with each step I took. I ended up in the city library, desperate for answers. I combed through old maps of the city, trying to find any mention of tunnels or caverns beneath 5th Street. There were none, at least none that were officially documented. But something caught my eye in the historical archives, an old newspaper clipping from the early 1900s. Strange disappearances in the caves beneath the city, the headline read. My heart skipped a beat as I read on. According to the article, several workers had gone missing while expanding the city's sewer system. Rumors had spread that the city was built on top of ancient caves, stretching far deeper than anyone had ever known. The article mentioned locals reporting strange noises and, most disturbingly, sightings of figures deep within the caves, figures that looked almost human but not quite. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. The more I read, the clearer it became. These caves weren't just ordinary underground passages. They were ancient, older than the city itself, and according to some, inhabited. I should have stopped there, walked away, and tried to forget what I had seen. But I couldn't. I needed to know more. I returned to the sinkhole that night. It was bigger now, stretching halfway across the street. The air around it felt even colder, a deep, bone-chilling cold that didn't belong on a summer night. This time, I brought a flashlight. I stood at the edge, shining it down into the darkness. The beam cut through the black, revealing more of those figures. But now I could see them more clearly. They were tall, too tall, with long, thin limbs and faces that were human enough to be unsettling but twisted, as if they had been pulled into shapes that no human should ever take. I gasped, stepping back, but the ground gave way beneath me. I fell, sliding down the loose gravel, tumbling into the darkness below. When I landed, I was in one of the caves I had read about. The air was thick with dampness, and the walls were rough, ancient. My flashlight flickered, casting long shadows on the stone, and in those shadows, I saw them, the inhabitants. They stood, watching me, their eyes glinting in the dim light. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might stop altogether. The inhabitants didn't move. They just stood there, their faces blank, eyes hollow but full of some ancient, unspeakable knowledge. I realized then that they had been watching the city for a long time, influencing it, shaping it. The sinkhole wasn't a coincidence, it was a doorway. And I had just crossed through. I stood frozen, my feet rooted to the cold, damp ground, unable to look away from the figures in the shadows. Their eyes glistened in the dim light of my flickering flashlight, and though their faces were twisted and unrecognizable, there was something undeniably human about them. It was that familiarity that made my skin crawl. These creatures, these things, weren't entirely alien. They were something that had once been human, or maybe something that had mimicked us so perfectly it was hard to tell the difference. I tried to steady my breath, but fear gripped my chest like a vice. I wanted to move, to run, but I couldn't. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else. I could only stand there, my mind spinning with panic, trying to make sense of what was happening. They began to move, slowly, almost as if they were gliding over the uneven ground. I could see their limbs stretching unnaturally, bending at odd angles, their faces turning toward me in unison. I wanted to scream, but the sound was stuck in my throat. The only noise was the soft shuffle of their movements and the distant echo of water dripping in the depths of the cave. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed by fear, but eventually I forced myself to take a step back, then another. The creatures didn't follow. They simply watched, their hollow eyes locked onto mine, as if waiting for something. I turned and ran. The cave walls seemed to close in around me as I sprinted through the darkness, my flashlight barely illuminating the narrow path ahead. My heart pounded in my ears, and every breath felt like it might be my last. The further I ran, the more I realized that I didn't know where I was going. The cave system was vast, and I had no idea how deep I had fallen or how to get back to the surface. I stumbled, my foot catching on a rock, and I fell hard, the flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering against the stone floor. The light flickered and went out, plunging me into complete darkness. For a moment, I lay there, gasping for breath, the cold stone pressing against my cheek. My body screamed at me to get up, to keep running, but I was too exhausted to move. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the faint sound of water dripping somewhere far away. And then I heard something else, a soft whisper, just at the edge of my hearing. It was faint, like the wind brushing against the walls of the cave, but it was unmistakable. I wasn't alone. I scrambled for the flashlight, my hand shaking as I fumbled to turn it back on. When the beam finally cut through the darkness, it illuminated a figure standing just a few feet away from me. It wasn't one of the twisted creatures I had seen earlier. This figure was different, tall and gaunt, but with a face that was almost familiar. It was a man. Or at least, it looked like one. His clothes were tattered, covered in dirt and dust, and his skin was pale, as if he hadn't seen sunlight in years. His eyes, though those hollow, haunted eyes, looked as though they had seen far more than any human should. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. There was no malice in his tone, just a quiet, desperate warning. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What is this place?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder, back toward the darkness from which I had come. "They're watching," he said, his voice low. "They always watch." I followed his gaze, shining my flashlight into the blackness. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, those same twisted figures, lurking just out of sight. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Who are they?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "They've been here long before the city," the man said. "Before any of us. They're the inhabitants of the old world, the ones that were forgotten." His words sent a wave of cold dread through me. "What do they want?" I asked. "They don't want," he replied. "They wait." The man's cryptic answers only deepened my fear. Wait for what? For the city to crumble. For us to fall. They're patient, you see. They've lived down here for centuries, watching, influencing, waiting. And when the time comes, his voice trailed off, and he turned to face me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. You shouldn't have come here. Now that they've seen you, they won't let you leave. A cold knot formed in my stomach. What do you mean? They've been watching you for a while now, he said. Ever since you noticed the sinkhole. That was the first crack, the first sign. The ground is weakening, and when it gives way, they'll rise. I felt my breath catch in my throat. How do you know all this? The man's expression hardened. Because I used to be like you. I was curious, too. But curiosity is dangerous down here. Once you see them, once you know they exist, you can't escape. I shook my head, refusing to accept what he was saying. There has to be a way out. There has to be. He looked at me with a sadness that pierced my soul. There isn't. I took a step back, my mind racing. There had to be some way to escape, some way to undo whatever had been set in motion. But the more I thought about it, the more hopeless it seemed. The inhabitants had been here for centuries, hiding beneath the city, influencing it in ways we could never understand. How could I possibly fight something so ancient, so powerful? The man must have seen the despair in my eyes because he took a step toward me, his voice softening. The only thing you can do now is survive. Don't let them see your fear. They feed on it. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed him. My heart was pounding, my pulse racing with fear, but I forced myself to keep my composure. What do I do? Stay quiet. Stay out of sight. And whatever you do, don't look directly at them. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. Where do I go? The man pointed down the tunnel, away from the direction I had come. There's a way out further ahead. But you'll have to move quickly. They won't wait long. I nodded, clutching the flashlight in my trembling hand. I didn't know if I could trust him, but I didn't have any other options. I took a deep breath and turned to run. As I disappeared into the darkness, I could feel their eyes on me, the inhabitants, watching, waiting. And I knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The tunnel stretched endlessly ahead, a narrow, suffocating passage of stone and dirt that seemed to tighten with every step. My flashlight barely illuminated the few feet in front of me, and the darkness beyond felt alive, pulsing with the weight of unseen eyes. The air was damp and heavy, making it difficult to breathe, and with each step, I felt the cold presence of the inhabitants lingering just out of sight. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching me. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to turn back, to abandon this nightmare and flee to the surface. But the man's words echoed in my mind, there's a way out ahead, but you'll have to move quickly. I had no choice but to push forward. The tunnel seemed to stretch on for hours, though I knew it had only been minutes. My mind was racing, replaying everything the man had told me. The inhabitants were ancient, older than the city itself, waiting for the ground to crumble so they could rise. But why? What did they want? And why had no one ever spoken of them before? I had always heard rumors about the caves beneath the city, old stories passed down by the elders, whispered in hushed tones around campfires. Some said they were haunted, cursed by the spirits of those who had died in mining accidents long ago. Others claimed there were entire networks of tunnels used by smugglers and criminals, hiding their illicit activities beneath the surface. But no one had ever mentioned the inhabitants, these twisted, human-like creatures that had been watching us for centuries. The tunnel began to widen, and the air grew colder. I could hear the faint sound of water rushing somewhere nearby, the distant roar of an underground river. It was louder now, more pronounced, as if I was getting closer to something important. I stopped for a moment to catch my breath, pressing my back against the damp stone wall. The tunnel ahead split into two paths, one leading down into deeper darkness, the other curving sharply to the left. I hesitated, unsure which way to go. There were no signs, no markers, nothing to guide me. Only the endless blackness that seemed to pull at the edges of my mind. A soft sound echoed through the tunnel, like the rustle of dry leaves or the faint brush of something moving against the stone. I turned, shining my flashlight into the darkness behind me, but saw nothing. My heart was pounding in my chest, and the sweat on my skin had turned cold. I wasn't alone. I had to choose a path, and quickly. The man had said to move fast, but every fiber of my being was frozen with indecision. The tunnel to the left seemed safer, wider, less steep, but the sound of the water drew me toward the darker path. If there was a river, there might be an exit, some way out of this nightmare. But what if it led me deeper into their territory? What if they were waiting for me down there? The sound came again, closer this time, definitely something moving behind me. I made my decision. Without another second of hesitation, I took the path toward the water, my flashlight bouncing in my hand as I hurried forward. The walls of the tunnel grew narrower, the ceiling lower, forcing me to crouch as I moved. The sound of the water was louder now, almost deafening, and the tunnel floor sloped downward sharply. My feet slid on the wet stone, and I had to brace myself against the walls to keep from falling. As I descended deeper, the tunnel opened up into a vast cavern. The roar of the river filled the space, echoing off the walls. The water rushed past in a torrent, its surface churning with foam and debris. I shone my flashlight across the cavern, searching for a way out, but there was nothing. No exit. Just the river, the jagged rocks, and the endless darkness beyond. My heart sank. I had made the wrong choice. Suddenly, a flash of movement caught my eye. I swung the flashlight toward the riverbank, and there, standing in the shallow water, was one of them. The inhabitants. It was smaller than the others I had seen, its body hunched, its skin pale and glistening in the dim light. Its face was turned away from me, but I could see the sharp angles of its limbs, the way its arms hung unnaturally long at its sides. It didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. It simply stood there, staring at the rushing water. My stomach turned. I backed away slowly, trying to stay as quiet as possible, but the wet stone beneath my feet betrayed me. My boots slipped on the slick surface, and I stumbled, the noise echoing loudly in the cavern. The creature's head snapped around, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. The air between us was thick with tension, as if the entire cavern was holding its breath. And then, it screamed. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard, high-pitched, guttural, like the wail of something that shouldn't exist. It echoed off the cavern walls, piercing through the roar of the river, and in that instant, I knew that I was no longer alone. More figures emerged from the shadows, their twisted forms moving with unnatural speed toward me. They poured from the darkness like a swarm, their pale skin glistening in the light of my flashlight. There were dozens of them, maybe more, all converging on me with terrifying precision. I turned and ran, my lungs burning with effort as I sprinted back up the tunnel. The sound of their screams followed me, growing louder with every step. I could feel them closing in, their presence like a weight pressing against my back. I was running blind now, the flashlight swinging wildly in my hand, illuminating nothing but the stone walls and the path ahead. I didn't stop. I couldn't. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness swallowing me whole. I could hear their footsteps now, sharp, quick, like nails tapping against stone. They were right behind me. My mind raced with panic. I had to find a way out. I had to escape. But the walls of the tunnel felt like they were closing in, the air growing thicker, suffocating. My vision blurred, my muscles screamed in protest, but I kept running, driven by pure survival instinct. Finally, I saw a faint light ahead, a small, flickering glow at the end of the tunnel. It was dim, barely noticeable, but it was something. It was hope. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning as I sprinted toward the light. The sound of the creatures behind me grew fainter, drowned out by the pounding of my own heart. I was close now, so close. As I reached the source of the light, I stumbled into a small chamber, the tunnel behind me disappearing into the blackness. The light was coming from an old, rusted lantern hanging from the ceiling, its flame flickering weakly. The room was empty, save for a narrow stone staircase carved into the far wall, leading upward. I didn't think. I didn't question. I just ran. The stairs were steep, each step feeling like a monumental effort as I climbed, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The light of the lantern faded behind me, replaced by the cold, oppressive darkness of the cave. But I kept going, driven by the faint hope that this staircase might lead to the surface, to safety. The staircase seemed to go on forever, each step blending into the next until it felt like I had been climbing for days. My legs were shaking, and my lungs felt like they were on fire, but the thought of those things behind me, lurking in the dark, kept me moving. Every once in a while, I would hear faint noises from below, echoes of footsteps, or the faint rustle of movement. But the further I climbed, the quieter it became, as though the creatures had lost interest in the chase. Or worse, they were waiting. The air grew colder as I ascended, and I began to notice faint signs of civilization, crumbling bricks embedded in the walls, rusted metal pipes, and broken glass scattered along the stone steps. It was a strange contrast, as if the ancient caves were slowly merging with the forgotten infrastructure of the city above. I had no idea where I was going, but at least it felt like I was moving towards something recognizable. At last, the stairs ended in a small, round chamber. The ceiling was low, and the air was musty, but I could see a faint glow coming from a crack in the far wall. I stumbled toward it, my heart pounding in my chest, and found an old, rusted metal door. The glow came from the gap between the door and the floor, a thin sliver of light that felt like salvation. With trembling hands, I gripped the handle and pulled. The door groaned in protest, its hinges stiff with rust, but after a moment of effort, it gave way. Light flooded into the chamber, momentarily blinding me. I staggered out, blinking against the sudden brightness, and found myself in an abandoned subway tunnel. The walls were lined with faded advertisements and graffiti, the floor littered with broken tiles and debris. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered weakly, casting long, wavering shadows across the platform. It was eerie, but it was familiar. I had seen this place before, a forgotten part of the old subway system, long since decommissioned and left to rot. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope that I had escaped, that I was finally safe. But as I looked around, the reality of my situation began to sink in. The tunnel stretched in both directions, disappearing into the gloom. There was no sign of an exit, no indication of where I was or how to get out. And worse, the feeling of being watched still clung to me, like an invisible weight pressing down on my shoulders. I wasn't alone. I walked cautiously down the platform, my flashlight still clutched tightly in my hand. The echo of my footsteps bounced off the walls, unnervingly loud in the silence. There was no sound of trains, no distant hum of electricity, just the hollow emptiness of the abandoned station. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that there was something here with me, lurking just out of sight. Then, I saw it. At the far end of the platform, where the shadows were deepest, stood a figure. It was barely visible in the dim light, its form hazy and indistinct, but I could tell it was human-like. Tall and thin, its posture unnatural, as though it was straining against some unseen force. For a moment, I thought it was one of the inhabitants from the caves, but something about it was different. It didn't move, didn't react to my presence. It just stood there, watching. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The figure was too far away for me to make out any details, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. I wanted to run, to turn and flee back into the tunnels, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the intensity of its gaze. And then, slowly, it started to move. It wasn't like the jerky, unnatural movements of the creatures below. This was deliberate, methodical, as though it was gliding across the floor rather than walking. The shadows seemed to cling to it, swallowing the figure whole as it approached. My mouth went dry, and a wave of nausea rolled over me. There was something deeply wrong about this figure, something that didn't belong in this world. I forced myself to move, my legs trembling as I backed away, my eyes locked on the approaching figure. But as I stumbled backward, I realized that the tunnel behind me was no longer an option. The door I had come through had vanished, replaced by a solid wall of concrete. I was trapped. Panic surged through me. I looked around frantically, searching for another way out, but there was nothing, just the endless tunnel and the figure drawing ever closer. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, and I could feel the walls closing in around me, the oppressive weight of the underground pressing down on my chest. The figure was closer now, its face still hidden in shadow. I could see its outline more clearly, a tall, gaunt form, its limbs too long, its body too thin. Its head tilted slightly, as though it was studying me, waiting for something. My skin crawled. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. Just as I was about to scream, a sudden noise echoed through the tunnel, a loud, metallic clang that reverberated off the walls. The figure stopped, its head snapping to the side, as if distracted by the sound. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran. My feet pounded against the platform, the sound of my footsteps mixing with the echoes of the metallic noise. I didn't know where I was going, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. The tunnel seemed to stretch on endlessly, the flickering lights overhead casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see the figure following me, but it was gone. The tunnel opened up into another station, equally abandoned, but this one had more signs of life, old, rusted vending machines, graffiti-covered benches, and a flight of stairs leading up to the surface. I sprinted toward the stairs, my heart racing, and threw myself onto the first step, climbing two at a time. The sound of my own breathing was deafening in my ears, but all I could think about was getting out, escaping this nightmare. I reached the top of the stairs and burst out onto the street, gasping for air. The cool night breeze hit my face, and for a moment, I just stood there, trying to catch my breath. The city stretched out before me, quiet and still, the buildings towering overhead like silent sentinels. The familiar sounds of cars and distant voices were a welcome relief after the oppressive silence of the tunnels. But something wasn't right. The street was empty, eerily empty. There were no people, no traffic, no signs of life. The buildings loomed over me, their windows dark and lifeless. A chill ran down my spine. I had escaped the tunnels, but I hadn't escaped the city. I looked around, my mind racing, trying to figure out what was wrong. And then, I saw them. In the shadows of the alleyways, beneath the flickering streetlights, they were watching me. The inhabitants. They had followed me to the surface, their twisted forms blending with the darkness, their hollow eyes fixed on me. They were everywhere, surrounding me, silent and still. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The city was theirs. It always had been. And now, I was trapped. The weight of the silence crushed me. The inhabitants stood like statues, their gaunt forms barely visible in the dim light, blending with the decaying city. It was like the world had shifted, pulled beneath a veil of something ancient, something hidden that had always been there, just out of sight. I swallowed hard, the air thick with the sensation of being watched, every breath heavy with the knowledge that escape was impossible. I backed into the middle of the street, hoping for some sign of life, some indication that I wasn't entirely alone. But the city had become an echo of itself, empty, hollow. No cars passed, no voices sounded. The wind stirred, whispering through the cracks in the pavement, carrying with it a faint scent of decay. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the streets for any movement, but the inhabitants stayed in the shadows, their presence like a dark tide waiting to swallow me whole. I could feel the pressure mounting, the dread growing like a knot in my stomach. They weren't going to let me leave. Not this time. I had seen too much, ventured too deep into their world. I wasn't supposed to know, wasn't supposed to understand the truth of what lay beneath the city. But now, there was no turning back. A cold sweat broke across my skin as I took a cautious step forward, unsure if I was even still in the real world. The buildings loomed around me, towering monoliths of stone and glass, their windows dark and lifeless. It was as if the entire city had been swallowed by these things, these ancient, human-like entities who had existed long before the streets were paved, before the first brick was laid. I glanced toward the nearest alley, my heart hammering in my chest. One of them moved, a slow, deliberate shifting in the darkness. My throat tightened as I watched its elongated form slip from shadow to shadow, moving closer. My mind screamed at me to run, but where? There was nowhere to go. This wasn't just a city anymore, it was a maze, a labyrinth of their design. In a sudden burst of desperation, I sprinted toward a side street, my legs burning with the effort. My shoes slapped against the pavement, echoing through the eerie stillness. I couldn't hear them, but I knew they were there, following, closing in. Every corner I turned seemed to lead me deeper into the city's decaying heart, where the buildings crumbled and the streetlights flickered and died. It felt like the world itself was collapsing, folding in on me. But then, I saw it, a small glimmer of hope. Up ahead, an old, rusted fire escape clung to the side of a dilapidated building. The metal was covered in grime, its bolts rusted and worn, but it led upward, toward the rooftops, toward the sky, toward freedom. Without hesitation, I threw myself at the ladder, gripping the cold metal with trembling hands. I climbed, every muscle in my body screaming in protest, the fear of those things behind me driving me upward. The fire escape groaned under my weight, each rung shaking as I pulled myself higher and higher. I didn't dare look down. I didn't want to see them below, didn't want to see their hollow eyes watching me ascend. All I could do was focus on the top, on reaching the rooftop where, maybe, just maybe, I could catch a breath of air, a glimpse of normality. But when I reached the top, the reality of my situation hit me like a freight train. The city stretched out beneath me, a sprawling landscape of shadows and decay. The rooftops, once familiar, were covered in a thick layer of grime, their edges crumbling into the darkness below. The distant skyline, which should have been dotted with lights and activity, was nothing more than a silhouette against the night sky, empty, desolate. And scattered across the rooftops, barely visible in the gloom, were more of them. The inhabitants. They stood in silence, their twisted forms watching me from every direction. Some were perched on the edges of buildings, their long limbs dangling over the sides. Others stood motionless in doorways or atop rusted ventilation units, their hollow eyes fixed on me. It was as if they had been waiting for me, knowing that I would end up here, trapped in their web. There was nowhere left to run. I backed up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing for a way out. But there was none. The inhabitants had taken the city, the real city, the one that existed in the spaces between, in the cracks and crevices where no one ever looked. They had been here all along, influencing the people, shaping the streets, watching from the shadows. And now, I was part of it. I had seen too much, ventured too far into their world. I could feel their presence pressing in on me, suffocating me. The air was thick with the weight of their existence, and I knew, deep down, I would never escape. As I stood there, surrounded by the silent, watching figures, a realization washed over me: this was not a city of the living. It never had been. The real city, the one I had known, was merely a facade, a thin layer of reality draped over the ancient, dark truth that lay beneath. The inhabitants weren't just creatures of the caves, they were the city itself. They had always been here, lurking beneath the surface, pulling the strings, shaping the lives of everyone who lived above. And now, I was part of it. The last thing I saw before the darkness closed in was their faces, those hollow, empty faces, smiling. Dark footprints. Have you ever felt that creeping sensation, as if something is watching you, but when you turn around, nothing is there? That sense of unease that crawls up your spine and makes your breath hitch, just for a second, before you brush it off as your imagination? I used to feel that way sometimes, but I never thought much of it until the footprints appeared. It started on a cold autumn morning. My wife, Claire, and I had recently moved into an old Victorian house, one of those large, weather-beaten homes that seemed to grow with age. We were drawn to it by its character and charm, the way the wooden floors creaked beneath our feet, and the wide, open spaces that filled us with a sense of history. It felt like a house with a soul. But souls, I would soon learn, can carry dark secrets. The first time we noticed the footprints was after one of those late nights when I had stayed up working in my study. It was past midnight, and the house was still, the only sound being the soft rustling of trees outside. I was walking back to the bedroom when I saw them, faint, almost unnoticeable at first, but there, pressed into the dust along the hallway floor. They weren't our footprints. Claire had been in bed for hours, and mine couldn't have left such a strange mark. The prints were smaller, narrower, as if someone had been walking barefoot through the house. I knelt down, studying them closer. They led from the staircase and disappeared near the entrance to her bedroom. My chest tightened, but I shook it off. It had to be some trick of the light, or maybe I had been too tired to notice them before. But something nagged at me, an odd sense of wrongness that I couldn't quite place. I mentioned it to Claire the next morning, but she just smiled, half asleep, and dismissed it with a wave of her hand. It's probably from the movers, or maybe we tracked in some dirt. Don't worry about it, she said, her voice muffled by the pillow. But I did worry. The following days passed without much incident, though I found myself increasingly uneasy. I began waking up in the middle of the night, not from sounds, but from a sensation, as if something unseen had stirred just beyond the edges of my perception. Each time, I would lie in bed, listening, waiting for something that never came. Then one morning, the footprints reappeared. This time, Claire saw them too. They were scattered across the kitchen floor, leading in and out of the room as though someone, or something, had been pacing during the night. The air felt heavy with an unspoken fear as we stood there, staring down at them. "I thought it was just dust," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "But they're fresh." We spent the next few hours trying to rationalize it, blaming everything from drafts to old floorboards settling, but the explanations felt hollow. Neither of us wanted to say what we were both thinking, that someone had been in our house, and they had left no trace but these ghostly footprints. Over the next few days, the sense of being watched became more intense. Every creak of the house, every shadow that flickered in the corners of my vision, set my nerves on edge. And the footprints, they became more frequent. They would appear overnight, sometimes leading from room to room, other times stopping abruptly in the middle of the hallway as if their maker had vanished into thin air. I began locking the doors and windows obsessively, checking every night before bed. Yet, the footprints always returned, undisturbed by any lock or barrier. I could no longer sleep soundly, constantly waking with the feeling that I was not alone, that something was standing over me, watching. Claire, too, became more withdrawn. She would sit in silence for hours, her eyes darting nervously toward darkened corners, her hands trembling as if she sensed something lurking just beyond her sight. One evening, as we sat in the living room, I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, there was movement, just a flicker, barely perceptible. But when I turned, I saw the faint outline of a figure standing in the doorway. It was only there for a second. A shape, dark and shadowed, just long enough for my breath to catch in my throat before it faded, as if melting into the wall itself. Claire gasped, her hand gripping my arm tightly. "Did you see it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, my heart racing. From that moment on, the fear became tangible. The house no longer felt like ours, it felt inhabited by something else, something unseen. The footprints were no longer our biggest concern, now we were dealing with the presence, the dark figure that seemed to drift just beyond our reach, always watching but never showing itself fully. Days passed in a blur of sleepless nights and mounting dread. We argued more frequently, our nerves frayed by the constant feeling of being on edge. But no matter how much we fought, there was always that unspoken understanding between us. Something had come into our home, something we couldn't explain, and it wasn't leaving. One night, the silence in the house became too much to bear. I lay awake, listening to the ticking of the clock on the nightstand, the only sound breaking the oppressive stillness. Claire had fallen asleep beside me, her breathing slow and steady. But I couldn't rest. I had to know. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, careful not to wake her, and crept down the hallway toward the source of our fear. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the staircase where the footprints had first appeared. The air felt colder here, as though the house itself had grown chillier in the night. And then, I saw them. The footprints leading from the base of the stairs and into the darkness of the basement. For a moment, I stood frozen, my mind racing. I had never considered the basement. It was one of those spaces we had barely explored since moving in. Just old storage boxes and dusty corners, or so I thought. But now, something was calling me there. As I stood at the top of the stairs, staring down into the abyss, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had left those footprints was waiting for me, down there, in the dark. Taking a deep breath, I gripped the railing and stepped onto the first stair, feeling the wood creak beneath my weight. Each step felt like a challenge, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, to retreat to the safety of the light. But something deeper compelled me to go on. The air grew colder as I descended, wrapping around me like a thick fog, and with every step, the silence became more pronounced. When I reached the bottom, I found myself standing in the basement, a dimly lit space cluttered with old furniture draped in white sheets, boxes stacked haphazardly against the walls, and an unsettling darkness that seemed to seep from the corners. The only light came from a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, swinging slightly as if stirred by an unseen hand. The footprints were clearer now, leading deeper into the room, toward a narrow door I had never noticed before. It was old, the wood splintered and gray, as if it had been untouched for decades. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in the silence of the basement. I felt a mix of dread and curiosity, an urge to know what lay beyond that door. I approached cautiously, glancing over my shoulder to make sure Claire was still asleep, though a part of me wished she were there with me. The shadows seemed to stretch and grow, clawing at the edges of my vision. I reached for the doorknob, which felt cool to the touch, and twisted it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing a dark passageway that seemed to stretch infinitely into the unknown. As I stepped inside, the air thickened, pressing against me like a heavy blanket. I took a few hesitant steps forward, the floor beneath my feet transforming from concrete to a soft, damp earth. The sound of dripping water echoed in the distance, and the smell of mold and decay wrapped around me. I fumbled for my phone, using its light to cut through the darkness, and what I saw sent a shiver down my spine. The walls of the passageway were covered in strange markings, scratches, and symbols that seemed almost alive, pulsating with a dark energy. They twisted and turned, forming patterns I couldn't decipher, but one thing was clear: I was not the first to venture down here. As I continued further in, the footprints became clearer, deeper, as if someone had been pacing back and forth. I could almost hear the whispers of those who had come before me, echoing in the silence. My heart raced as I felt an icy draft sweep through the passage, and I turned abruptly, half expecting to see the figure again. But there was nothing, only the suffocating darkness. Then, just as I was about to turn back, a sudden flash of light illuminated the corridor. It came from deeper within, a soft, flickering glow that danced along the walls like a flame. I felt an undeniable pull toward it, an insatiable curiosity mingled with terror. Against my better judgment, I moved forward. The glow intensified as I approached, revealing a small chamber at the end of the passage. It was a room filled with old, dusty artifacts, broken toys, withered photographs, and small, odd trinkets scattered across a makeshift table. But what caught my eye was an ornate mirror standing against the far wall. It was beautifully crafted, with intricate designs carved into the frame, but the glass was clouded and dark, reflecting only a distorted version of the room. I stepped closer, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. My heart pounded louder in my ears, drowning out all other sounds. As I peered into the mirror, I felt a chill rush over me, as if the very air in the room had dropped in temperature. My reflection stared back, but behind me, in the dark corner of the room, something shifted. I turned around, but there was nothing there. My breath caught in my throat as I returned my gaze to the mirror, my heart pounding violently. The air crackled with energy, and I felt an overwhelming urge to touch the glass. Before I could stop myself, I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold surface. In that instant, a wave of emotion washed over me: fear, sadness, and an overwhelming sense of loss. The mirror seemed to respond, rippling like water, and I caught a glimpse of someone standing behind me. It was a child, small and fragile, with hollow eyes and a sorrowful expression. I stumbled back, my heart racing. "What do you want?" I shouted into the darkness, my voice trembling. The child remained silent, just staring at me, their gaze filled with an unfathomable sadness. I felt an invisible force pushing me back toward the mirror, as if it were trying to pull me in. I shook my head violently, desperate to break the connection. With a sudden burst of strength, I turned and ran back through the passage, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to get out, to escape whatever darkness lurked within the depths of the basement. As I sprinted up the stairs, I could feel the cold air chasing me, the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on my back. Bursting into the hallway, I rushed to her bedroom, nearly tripping over the threshold. Claire was still asleep, but the relief was short-lived. I slammed the door shut, locking it behind me. I leaned against it, panting, my heart racing as I tried to comprehend what had just happened. But then, a soft knock came from the other side of the door. The knock came again, soft yet persistent, sending icy tendrils of fear creeping up my spine. I held my breath, listening intently. The house was silent, save for the sound of my racing heart. I glanced at the door, half expecting to see the same small child from the mirror standing on the other side, their hollow eyes staring back at me. But it was only the door, solid and unyielding, keeping whatever was outside at bay. "Ben?" Claire's sleepy voice broke the silence, laced with concern. "Are you okay?" I hesitated, trying to gather my thoughts. How could I explain what I had just seen? The child, the mirror, the unsettling presence in the basement, none of it made sense. Instead, I took a deep breath and forced a shaky smile, hoping it would reach my voice. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just had a weird dream. Everything's okay." A moment of silence followed before Claire spoke again. "Are you sure? You sounded scared." Her concern pierced through the fog of my fear, grounding me for a moment. "I'm sure," I said more firmly. "Just a bad dream. I'll be right there." I opened the door a crack and peeked out. Claire was sitting up in bed, her hair tousled, her eyes still heavy with sleep but filled with worry. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me, the weight of the world pressing down on my shoulders. "What happened?" she asked, her voice softening as she sensed my distress. I went down to the basement," I started, my voice barely above a whisper. "I found these footprints, and I wanted to check it out." I hesitated, my mind racing as I weighed whether to reveal the details about the mirror and the child. "I think I heard something down there. It just felt off." Claire's brow furrowed. "Footprints? What kind?" "Like small footprints." "I don't know, Claire. I just felt this overwhelming dread." I rubbed my temples, trying to push the images of the mirror and the child from my mind. "Maybe we should call someone," she suggested, concern etching her features. "A paranormal investigator or—" "No," I interrupted. The thought of inviting someone else into our home felt wrong. "I don't want to stir up anything more. I'll figure it out myself." Claire nodded slowly, but I could see the worry in her eyes. "Just promise me you won't go down there alone again." "I promise," I said, but even as I said it, I felt a flicker of doubt. The basement called to me, a haunting whisper that I couldn't ignore. We spent the rest of the night trying to distract ourselves, watching mindless television as the glow of the screen washed over us like a protective barrier. But sleep was elusive. Each creak of the house, each whisper of wind against the windows, sent my heart racing. As dawn broke, I found myself staring out the window, lost in thought. The world outside was bright and cheerful, a stark contrast to the shadows that loomed inside our home. I could feel the weight of the night still clinging to me, the memories of the basement and the mirror lingering like a bad taste in my mouth. "Do you want coffee?" Claire asked, breaking my reverie. "Yeah, that would be great," I replied, forcing a smile as I turned away from the window. I followed her into the kitchen, where the comforting scent of brewing coffee filled the air, but even that could not dispel the unease that hung over me. As we sipped our coffee, I felt a sense of normalcy return. We discussed our plans for the day, simple tasks that would keep us busy, but the specter of the basement loomed in the background, a shadow I couldn't shake. Later, as we cleaned the house, I found myself drawn back to the basement. The sunlight streaming through the windows had chased away the chill, and part of me felt emboldened. I couldn't let fear dictate my life, and I needed answers. "Hey, I'm going to check on the footprints," I called out to Claire as I headed toward the basement door. "Ben, please be careful," she replied, her tone laced with concern. "I will," I assured her, but inside, I felt a rush of adrenaline. As I descended the stairs once more, the familiar sense of dread returned, but this time I pushed through it, determined to uncover the truth. When I reached the bottom, the basement felt different, as if it were holding its breath in anticipation. The footprints remained visible in the dust, leading back to the dark passageway. I swallowed hard, knowing I had to confront whatever lay beyond. As I stepped into the passage again, the air grew colder, and the shadows deepened around me. I hesitated before reaching the door, but this time I was ready. I had to know what was waiting for me on the other side. Pushing the door open, I stepped into the chamber, heart pounding. The mirror stood there, untouched, still dark and foreboding. I approached cautiously, the weight of my fear mixing with an insatiable curiosity. What was the significance of that child? Why had I felt such a connection? As I stared into the mirror, I prepared myself for the worst, but what I saw sent my heart racing. In the glass, the child appeared again, but this time they were not alone. Behind them loomed a figure, tall and shadowy, its features indistinguishable yet distinctly threatening. "Help us," the child whispered, their voice echoing in my mind. "Please." I stumbled back, heart racing, realizing that the darkness was not just a product of my imagination. Something truly malevolent lingered in the depths of that mirror. "Get out!" I shouted, turning on my heel and running back down the passage, fear propelling me forward. The house felt alive with energy as I burst into the main area, slamming the door behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I leaned against the door, desperately trying to shake the image from my mind. But the echo of the child's plea lingered, a haunting reminder that whatever was down there was not finished with me yet. The day dragged on, a never-ending loop of mundane activities. I attempted to focus on chores, but my mind kept wandering back to the basement, to that mirror, and the shadowy figure lurking behind the child. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to pounce. Claire noticed my distraction. "Ben, are you sure you're all right?" she asked again, her concern deepening. "You seem distant." I forced a smile, not wanting to burden her with my fears. "I'm fine. Just tired, I guess. The basement, it just freaked me out a little." She reached out, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Maybe we should talk to someone. It's been a rough couple of days. You don't have to handle this alone. The thought of bringing someone else into our home, a stranger who might stir up whatever was lurking in the basement, made my skin crawl. No, Claire. I can handle this, I replied, though I could feel my resolve wavering. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the living room, the atmosphere shifted. The warm hues of daylight faded, replaced by the eerie glow of twilight. The house felt more alive than ever, the creaks and groans of the old structure echoing through the air like whispers. I sat down on the couch, trying to push aside my growing anxiety. Claire was in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner, the sound of comfort against the oppressive silence. But even her presence couldn't ease the unsettling feeling in my gut. As dinner progressed, I could hardly focus on the food. Each bite felt like a chore, each moment spent in the living room only intensifying my unease. I kept glancing toward the basement door, the heavy wood standing like a sentinel between our world and whatever lay beneath. Ben? Are you sure you're all right? Claire asked again, concern etched on her face. Yeah, I replied, though the light tasted bitter on my tongue. Just a little tired. The moment dinner ended, I excused myself, needing to escape the suffocating atmosphere. I think I'll go for a walk, I said, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. Be careful. It's getting dark, Claire warned, her eyes searching mine. Don't worry, I'll be back soon, I assured her, though I felt the weight of uncertainty press down on me. As I stepped outside, the cool evening air hit my face like a splash of water. The quiet street felt both familiar and foreign, shadows dancing in the dim light of the street lamps. I walked aimlessly, my mind racing as I replayed the events of the past few days. The child in the mirror, the footsteps, the overwhelming dread, it all swirled together, forming a tapestry of fear I couldn't escape. I found myself drawn to the park, where I could hear the distant laughter of children playing, their joy contrasting sharply with the darkness that loomed in my mind. But as I wandered, the laughter faded, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The park, usually a sanctuary, now felt haunted. I could almost see the shadows creeping in, wrapping around the trees like dark tendrils. I shuddered at the thought and turned to head back home. When I returned, the house stood ominously in the twilight, windows darkened as if holding its breath. I stepped inside, expecting to find Claire waiting for me, but the silence was heavy and oppressive. Claire? I called out, my voice echoing through the empty halls. No answer. Panic surged within me. I rushed through the house, searching every room, calling her name, but she was nowhere to be found. The anxiety that had been simmering in the back of my mind now boiled over, filling me with dread. I headed toward the basement, compelled by inexplicable force. As I reached the door, I hesitated, the memories of the mirror flooding my mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Claire might be down there. I needed to know. Pushing the door open, I descended the stairs, the familiar chill wrapping around me like a shroud. The darkness enveloped me, and I paused at the bottom, my heart pounding in my chest. Claire? I called again, my voice barely a whisper. The basement was still, a graveyard of echoes. I could see the faint outline of the mirror in the dim light, its surface reflecting only darkness. The footsteps in the dust remained, untouched, leading toward the dark passageway. With each step, my pulse quickened. I approached the mirror, drawn in by a strange magnetism. Claire! I shouted, desperation clawing at my throat. And then I saw her. A figure stood behind the mirror, a silhouette shrouded in shadow. Help us, the child's voice echoed in my mind again, pleading and desperate. I staggered back, terror flooding my senses. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice breaking. The shadow behind the mirror shifted, the features becoming more defined. It wasn't just the child anymore. The figures seemed to grow taller, darker, the air thickening with malevolence. "Help us," it repeated, the words twisted and distorted, sending chills down my spine. The room around me began to warp and twist, the walls pulsing with a dark energy. I turned, ready to flee, but as I moved, I felt an icy grip on my arm, halting me in place. My heart raced as I looked back at the mirror, the shadowy figure now looming larger, its presence suffocating. "You can't escape," it hissed, its voice a chilling whisper that echoed in the dark. I struggled against the grip, fear surging through me. "Let me go!" I yelled, my voice breaking as panic enveloped me. But just as suddenly as it had appeared, the grip released, and I stumbled back, collapsing to the floor. The room fell silent, the air heavy with dread. I pulled myself to my feet, breathless and trembling. "Claire!" I shouted again, desperation gnawing at me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a flicker of movement. A shadow darted past, quick and elusive. "Claire?" I called, but my voice felt small and weak. I took a step toward the passage, the coldness biting at my skin, and as I did, a chilling realization hit me. The basement was no longer just a place of fear, it was a gateway, a threshold between our world and something far more sinister. I needed to get out. I needed to find Claire. As I turned to escape, the mirror shimmered, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw her face reflected in its depths, frightened and alone, begging for help. Adrenaline surged through my veins as I bolted up the basement stairs, each step echoing the urgency in my heart. I threw open the door, desperate to escape the chilling grip of the basement, but the fear of what lay beyond paralyzed me for a moment. "Claire!" I shouted again, my voice cracking under the weight of my panic. The house felt empty, haunted by the shadows of the past. I hurried through the darkened rooms, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Where could she be? Was she trapped? I made my way back to the living room, scanning every corner for any sign of her. The silence was deafening, and the shadows seemed to dance along the walls, mocking my fear. My heart sank as I considered the possibility that whatever had emerged from the basement had taken her. "Claire!" I called out one last time, my voice barely a whisper now. Just as I was about to give in to despair, I heard a faint sound from the kitchen, soft, almost like a whimper. I rushed toward it, praying that it was her. As I entered the kitchen, the light flickered erratically, casting eerie shadows that flickered like ghostly figures on the walls. And there, in the corner, I saw her. Claire stood rigid, her back turned to me, staring blankly at the wall. My heart plummeted. "Claire!" I reached out, my voice rising with urgency. "What's wrong? Are you okay?" She didn't respond. The air grew heavy with a sense of dread as I moved closer, fear gripping my chest. I gently touched her shoulder, and she flinched, as if awakening from a trance. "Ben," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "What happened?" I felt something." "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though my heart raced. "I felt drawn here," she said, her gaze still fixated on the wall. Like something was calling me. I followed her gaze, my stomach tightening. The wall looked normal, but a cold sweat broke out on my skin. "We need to get out of this house," I urged. I think something is trying to get to us. I saw a shadow in the mirror. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I saw fear reflected in them. A shadow? Yes, I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. We need to leave. Right now. As we turned to leave, the lights flickered once more, and I caught a glimpse of something in the reflection of the window, a fleeting shadow darting behind us. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. Did you see that? I asked, my voice trembling. Claire nodded slowly, fear creeping into her eyes. What was it? Before I could answer, the temperature in the room plummeted. The air turned icy, and I could see my breath in front of me. Shadows twisted and contorted, warping into grotesque shapes. Run! I shouted, grabbing Claire's hand as I pulled her toward the front door. But as we reached it, the door slammed shut with a thunderous bang, as if the house itself was rebelling against our escape. I banged against it, desperation clawing at my throat. Let us out! I screamed, but the door refused to budge. The shadows around us thickened, swirling like a dark mist, and the air buzzed with an otherworldly energy. I could hear whispers, a chorus of voices echoing in the depths of my mind, urging me to stay, to listen. Ben. Claire's voice broke through the chaos, grounding me momentarily. We need to go back to the basement. We can't let it trap us here. Are you crazy? I shouted, fear choking my words. It's down there. That's where it all started. Exactly. It's trying to keep us here. We have to confront it. With a deep breath, I nodded. Okay, let's do it. We turned back toward the kitchen, and as we made our way through the shadows, I could feel a pull toward the basement, a magnetic force that both terrified and compelled me. We reached the basement door, and it stood ominously ajar, inviting yet foreboding. As we descended the stairs, the darkness swallowed us whole. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and I could feel an electric charge in the atmosphere. Stay close, I whispered, feeling my heart race in the oppressive silence. As we reached the bottom, I turned to face the mirror, its surface now glimmering with an unnatural light. It looked almost alive, pulsing with dark energy. Whatever is in there, I said, we have to confront it together. Claire nodded, her expression fierce. We can do this. Together, we approached the mirror, and I placed my hand against its surface. The coldness seeped through my skin, sending a jolt of fear coursing through me. The reflections warped, and I saw the shadowy figure again, now larger and more defined, its features dark and twisted. Help us, it cried again, a cacophony of voices merging into one. No! I shouted, shaking my head. You don't get to control us. We're not afraid. But as I spoke those words, a wave of darkness surged from the mirror, enveloping us. I felt a force pushing against me, pulling me into its depths. Ben! Claire screamed, grasping my arm tightly. With everything I had, I pulled away, but the shadows clung to me, whispering promises of despair and hopelessness. You can't escape, they hissed, their voices clawing at my sanity. I could feel Claire's grip tightening on me, her determination flowing through us both. Together, she cried, her voice breaking through the darkness. We can fight this. Together, I echoed, and in that moment, we stood united against the shadows. With a primal roar, we pushed against the darkness, forcing it back. The room shook, the mirror shattering into countless fragments, each piece reflecting our terrified faces. The shadows writhed and screamed, retreating into the corners of the room, and I felt the grip around my heart loosen. The whispers faded into nothingness, replaced by a deafening silence. As the last remnants of darkness dissipated, I collapsed to the floor, panting heavily. "Is it over?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling with uncertainty. I looked around the basement, now bathed in the soft glow of moonlight filtering through the shattered mirror. "I think so," I replied, though doubt still lingered in the back of my mind. But even as we caught our breath, I felt a cold breeze sweep through the room, brushing against my skin like a warning. "Ben," Claire said, her voice small, "what if it's not truly gone?" I turned to her, my heart sinking. "I don't know," I admitted. "But we'll face it together, whatever it takes." As we rose to our feet, a shadow flickered at the edge of my vision. I turned quickly, my breath catching in my throat. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw the figure of the child, standing amidst the wreckage of the mirror, its small face twisted in a haunting smile. "Help us," it whispered once more, before vanishing into the darkness. And in that instant, I realized the truth. This battle was far from over. The darkness may have retreated for now, but it would always be watching, waiting for the moment to strike again. We had only just begun to uncover the horrors that lay beneath, and the dark footprints left in our lives would forever remind us of the shadows we could never fully escape. The Curse of the Ancient Cemetery. Have you ever felt a chill run down your spine just by stepping into a place that seemed untouched by time? A place where whispers lingered in the shadows, and every rustle of leaves felt like a warning? That's how it felt when my friends and I decided to explore the old cemetery on the edge of town, a decision that would lead us down a path we never anticipated. It was a warm autumn evening, and the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. We gathered at the corner of the local diner, our laughter blending with the clinking of plates and the buzz of conversation. There were 6 of us: Emily, the fearless leader; Jake, the skeptic; Sarah, who always felt an aura of dread in places like this; and then there was me, Mark, the storyteller. I had a penchant for spinning tales about local legends, and that evening I decided to weave a tale about the cemetery. "Did you know," I began, leaning in conspiratorially, "that this place is said to be haunted? People claim they've seen apparitions wandering among the graves, especially at night." I watched as their eyes widened in both intrigue and skepticism. "Oh please," Jake scoffed, rolling his eyes. "You really believe that nonsense? It's just a bunch of old gravestones." Emily, ever the adventurer, grinned. "Let's go find out for ourselves. It'll be fun." With her words, the seed of curiosity was planted. Before long, we found ourselves heading towards the cemetery, armed with flashlights and an air of bravado that quickly began to wane as we approached the wrought iron gate, its rusted hinges creaking like a ghostly moan. As we stepped through the gate, a palpable change enveloped us. The air felt heavier, charged with an energy I couldn't quite place. The path was overgrown, weeds tangled around the gravestones, and the smell of damp earth filled my nostrils. Each step echoed eerily, and the laughter that had once been light and carefree started to fade, replaced by a tense silence that wrapped around us like a shroud. "Maybe we should just turn back," Sarah suggested, her voice barely above a whisper. "Come on, don't be a chicken," Jake replied, his bravado returning as he pushed deeper into the cemetery. I could see that he was trying to mask his unease, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. We wandered among the headstones, our flashlights cutting through the encroaching darkness, illuminating names etched in stone, some faded, some nearly illegible. I paused at one particularly ornate grave, its inscription barely visible, and a strange feeling washed over me, like a cold hand grazing my skin. I glanced back at my friends, who were still exploring, their voices now hushed, as if the atmosphere demanded silence. "Look over here," Emily called, beckoning us toward an old mausoleum that loomed in the distance, its door slightly ajar. "Let's check it out." I hesitated, a knot forming in my stomach, but the thrill of adventure surged within me. We approached the mausoleum, the air growing colder as we drew near. I could see faint carvings on the stone, depicting figures lost in time. "What do you think is inside?" Jake asked, his bravado wavering as he peered into the darkness. "Probably just some dusty old bones," Emily joked, pushing the door open wider. It creaked ominously, as if protesting our intrusion. Inside, the darkness swallowed us whole. We switched on our flashlights, the beams dancing over cobwebs and dust-laden surfaces. An overwhelming sense of dread settled over me, but curiosity drove us deeper into the shadows. As we explored, I felt the weight of the air shift. It was as if something unseen was watching us, lurking just beyond the edges of our light. The walls seemed to whisper secrets, and I could have sworn I heard soft, echoing laughter, a sound that didn't belong to any of us. "Did you hear that?" I blurted, the words escaping before I could swallow them back. "Hear what?" Emily replied, turning her flashlight towards me. "That," I stammered, feeling foolish as I gestured toward the darkness behind her. It sounded like laughter. "Stop messing around, Mark," Jake said, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. We exchanged nervous glances, the atmosphere thickening with an unspoken tension. I took a step back, the ground crunching beneath my feet, and suddenly, the mausoleum felt less like an adventure and more like a tomb. "Let's get out of here," I suggested, my heart racing as I turned towards the exit. But as we stepped outside, a chilling breeze swept through the cemetery, sending a shiver down my spine. The laughter I had heard moments before was now replaced by a low, guttural sound that echoed from the depths of the graveyard. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. It was the sound of something ancient and malevolent, a warning echoing through the stillness. And in that moment, I knew we had crossed a line we could never uncross. As we stumbled back towards the gate, the atmosphere grew thick with foreboding. The shadows lengthened, and the once familiar path seemed to twist and turn, disorienting us. The laughter returned, but this time it was louder, closer, and filled with a sinister joy that made my skin crawl. "We need to leave. Now!" I urged, panic rising in my chest. But as we reached the gate, it creaked shut with a finality that sent a jolt of fear through me. We were trapped in a world that had shifted around us, and I could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching, waiting. Little did we know that our playful trespass into the realm of the dead would unleash something that could never be contained. "Guys, this isn't funny anymore," I muttered, pushing against the iron gate. It didn't budge. Panic swelled in my chest, constricting my throat. I glanced back at my friends, who were just as bewildered. "What the hell is going on?" Jake asked, his bravado replaced by a genuine fear that seeped into his voice. "Maybe it's just stuck," Emily suggested, though her eyes betrayed her growing anxiety. We all shoved against the gate, but it held firm, as if an unseen force was holding it closed. The laughter continued, echoing around us, swirling like a storm. I glanced around the cemetery, shadows dancing ominously under the flickering beams of our flashlights. "Let's try to find another way out," I proposed, my voice shaky but determined. "There has to be another exit." With heavy hearts, We turned away from the gate, our footsteps crunching on the gravel path as we ventured deeper into the cemetery. The trees that surrounded us seemed to loom taller and darker, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers reaching for the sky. The laughter faded into a soft whisper, as if the spirits were communicating among themselves, and the atmosphere thickened with a heavy dread that clung to us like fog. We walked in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. The playful adventure we had anticipated had morphed into a nightmare, and an invisible weight pressed down on our shoulders. As we passed an old oak tree, a sudden rustle made me jump. "What was that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Just a squirrel or something," Jake replied, but his tone lacked conviction. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. The whispers grew louder, swirling around us like an invisible fog. I glanced at Sarah, whose face was pale, eyes darting nervously. "Do you feel that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Feel what?" I asked, trying to suppress the chill creeping down my spine. "The air, it's different," she replied, her gaze fixed on something in the distance. I followed her gaze, and my heart dropped. A shadow flitted between the gravestones, a figure moving just beyond the reach of our light. My breath caught in my throat, and I fought the urge to scream. "Did you see that?" I gasped. Emily nodded slowly, her bravado faltering. "We need to get out of here, now!" But just as we turned to retrace our steps, the whispers crescendoed into a cacophony, overwhelming our senses. The sound was deafening, a blend of voices rising and falling in a rhythmic chant. I covered my ears, trying to drown it out, but it seeped into my mind, echoing with a haunting familiarity. "Mark, what's happening?" Jake shouted, his voice barely audible over the din. I don't know," I yelled back, my heart racing as panic set in. Suddenly, the ground beneath us trembled, and the laughter morphed into a scream that tore through the air. I looked around, my eyes wide with terror. The shadows twisted and contorted, taking on forms that were almost human, yet distorted and grotesque. "We have to run," I shouted, and without waiting for a response, I turned and sprinted down the path, my friends hot on my heels. We raced past gravestones, our flashlights flickering as if struggling to pierce the growing darkness. The whispers followed us, growing louder and more frenzied with each step we took. I could feel the presence behind us, something ancient and malevolent, a force that fed on our fear. "Where are we going?" Emily panted, her breath hitching as we veered to the left, searching for a way out. "I don't know," I cried, my mind racing. "Just keep moving." As we rounded a corner, I spotted a familiar monument, a towering stone angel that I had seen earlier. "This way," I shouted, leading us toward it, hoping it would guide us back to the entrance. But as we approached, I noticed something unsettling. The angel's eyes glinted in the flashlight's beam, and its once calm expression seemed to twist into a grimace. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and glanced around to find my friend staring wide-eyed at the statue. "Mark, did you see that?" Sarah asked, trembling. "It's just a statue," I insisted, but deep down, I felt the unease growing. The air felt thicker, heavier, and the whispers intensified, wrapping around us like chains. Then, just as I turned to lead us away, I heard it again, the laughter, now closer, echoing in the night. "It's playing with us," I thought, shivering at the realization. "We need to keep moving," I urged, and we pressed on, desperation fueling our steps. We navigated through the graves, the shadows closing in around us, but the whispers began to morph into words, words I could almost understand, though they danced just out of reach. My heart raced, fear mingling with a strange curiosity. "Did you hear that?" Emily breathed, her eyes wide with terror. I nodded, feeling a strange pull toward the sounds, an urge to uncover the truth behind the whispers. "We have to find out what they want." "Are you insane?" Jake hissed, his face pale. But before I could respond, a chill washed over us, and the ground began to quake. The mausoleum loomed before us once more, its door swinging open as if inviting us back into its depths. "Mark, we can't go back in there," Emily pleaded, her voice rising in panic. "We don't have a choice," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "It might be the only way to find out how to escape." With a shared glance of fear and uncertainty, we stepped back into the darkness of the mausoleum, the air thickening around us as the door creaked shut behind us. The door thudded shut behind us, plunging us into an oppressive darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, its beam flickering uncertainly before settling into a weak glow. The air was stale, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, wrapping around us like a heavy blanket. "Mark, are you sure this is a good idea?" Jake whispered, his voice trembling as he gripped the flashlight tightly. "Not really, but we don't have much of a choice," I admitted, my heart racing. The whispers outside faded into a haunting silence, but I could still feel them pressing in, urging us to uncover the truth hidden in the shadows. We stepped deeper into the mausoleum, our footsteps echoing eerily against the stone walls. I glanced at my friends, their faces pale and drawn, but curiosity flickered in their eyes, an unspoken agreement that we needed answers. The narrow corridor opened into a larger chamber, lined with stone sarcophagi that loomed like ancient sentinels. Dust motes danced in the weak light, creating a surreal atmosphere that sent a chill down my spine. "Look," Sarah said, pointing at an inscription on one of the sarcophagi. "This one looks different." We moved closer, the faint light revealing intricate carvings that depicted scenes of sorrow and despair, figures kneeling in supplication, shadows looming over them, their faces twisted in agony. My breath caught in my throat. It was a haunting portrayal of what lay beyond this world. "What does it say?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I leaned in closer, tracing the symbols with my finger. "It's hard to tell, but it mentions something about a curse, something about souls trapped between worlds." Jake's eyes widened in fear. "You don't think it's connected to what we heard outside, do you?" I felt a shiver run down my spine. "It might be." Just then, a cold gust of wind swept through the chamber, extinguishing our flashlights in an instant. Panic surged within me, and I felt my heart race as darkness enveloped us. "Turn them back on," I shouted, my voice echoing against the stone walls. "I can't. Mine won't work." Jake's voice quivered. "Hold on," I said, fumbling in my bag for the spare flashlight I always kept. My hand shook as I finally found it and turned it on, the beam illuminating the room once more. "Are we sure we want to be here?" Emily asked, her voice laced with fear. But before I could answer, a low moan resonated from the far end of the chamber, chilling me to the bone. We all froze, the sound hanging in the air like a sinister invitation. "What was that?" Jake asked, his face pale. I don't know," I stammered. The moaning grew louder, more desperate, echoing off the stone walls. It felt as if the very walls were crying out in anguish. My pulse quickened, the fear coiling around me like a serpent. "Guys, we need to leave," Sarah urged, but before we could make a move, a shadow darted across the wall, flickering just out of reach of the light. "Did you see that?" I gasped, my heart pounding. The moaning turned into whispers again, forming words that sent shivers down my spine. Help us, release us. We have to get out of here. Emily screamed, her panic palpable. Wait. What if they need help? I blurted out, a reckless curiosity pushing me forward. Are you crazy? Jake shouted, but the words were lost in the chaos of our fear. I felt a strange compulsion pulling me closer to the source of the sound, a desperate need to understand what was happening. Maybe if we listen, we can find a way to help them. Reluctantly, my friends followed, though I could see the terror etched on their faces. As we approached the far wall, the moaning intensified, the shadows swirling around us like a living thing. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, faint and translucent, its features distorted and twisted. My breath hitched in my throat as I recognized the anguished expression on its face, eyes wide with desperation. Release us, it wailed, reaching out with skeletal fingers. Stay back. Jake yelled, instinctively stepping in front of us. But the figure continued to advance, its voice rising in a haunting crescendo. You must help us. We're trapped. I felt the weight of its sorrow pressing against me, an overwhelming sense of loss that clawed at my insides. Ow! I found myself asking, my voice trembling. Find the medallion, it whispered, the words chilling me to the bone. It holds the key. The figure began to dissipate, fading into the shadows, leaving us breathless and trembling. Did you hear that? I asked, my heart racing. Find the medallion? What medallion? Jake questioned, his voice shaking. I don't know, but it's clear that something isn't right here, I replied, looking at each of my friends, their faces reflecting fear and uncertainty. Let's get out of here, Emily urged, her voice cracking. This place is cursed. As we turned to leave, the whispers returned, swirling around us, tugging at our minds. The shadows seemed to lengthen, reaching out for us, and the air thickened with an unbearable tension. Run! I shouted, and we dashed back toward the entrance, hearts pounding in sync with our desperate flight. But as we approached the door, it swung open with a creaking groan, revealing the night outside. Relief flooded through me, and we stumbled into the open air, gasping for breath. Yet the whispers followed us, weaving through the trees like a malignant breeze. What do we do now? Sarah asked, her voice trembling as we stood outside the mausoleum, the weight of our encounter heavy in the air. Find the medallion, I repeated, the urgency driving me forward. We need to know what we're up against. The night hung thick with dread as we huddled beneath the swaying branches of the ancient trees outside the mausoleum. The moon cast an eerie glow, illuminating the path back to our campus, but my mind was still reeling from the apparition we had encountered. Do you really think we can find this medallion? Jake asked, his brow furrowed with concern. We have to, I replied, trying to steady my racing heart. If it's the key to freeing those trapped souls, we need to find it. But where would it even be? Emily chimed in, her voice shaking. I remembered the carvings on the sarcophagus, the intricate designs that hinted at a deeper meaning. There must be clues in the cemetery. We need to look for anything that could lead us to it. With a collective breath, we began to retrace our steps, the whispers still echoing in our minds. Each rustle of leaves and distant hoot of an owl heightened our senses, reminding us of the danger that lurked nearby. As we entered the cemetery again, the air felt colder, the darkness more oppressive. We navigated through the graves, searching for any signs of the medallion. I glanced at the gravestones, each one telling a story, but they seemed to loom over us, watching our every move. Here, I pointed to a particularly ornate grave, adorned with intricate carvings of twisted vines and flowers. This one looks like it might hold something. We gathered around the grave, examining it closely. The name inscribed on the stone read Elena Thorne, and beneath it were the words "Beloved Daughter, Keeper of the Light." "What does that mean?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I felt a strange connection to the grave, a pull that urged me to dig deeper. Maybe the medallion is hidden with her. I knelt beside the grave, brushing away the dirt and debris that had accumulated over the years. As I dug, a sense of urgency filled the air, as if the earth itself was alive with anticipation. Suddenly, my fingers brushed against something cool and metallic. I gasped and pulled it out, revealing an old, tarnished medallion. It glimmered faintly in the moonlight, adorned with the same twisted vines etched on the gravestone. "Is this it?" Emily exclaimed, her eyes wide with wonder. "It has to be," I replied, my heart racing as I held it tightly in my palm. But as I examined it closely, the atmosphere shifted. The whispers intensified, swirling around us like a violent storm. "Get it away from me!" Jake shouted, stumbling back, his eyes wide with fear. "Wait!" I urged, feeling the medallion pulsing with a strange energy. "We have to find out how to use it." Suddenly, the ground beneath us trembled, and a deep rumble echoed through the cemetery. The air thickened with tension as shadows began to stretch and twist, forming shapes that loomed over us like towering figures. "We need to leave," Sarah yelled, panic rising in her voice. But it was too late. The shadows converged, revealing twisted faces that contorted in agony. The ground began to crack, and a dark mist poured forth, enveloping us in its suffocating grasp. "Hold the medallion," I shouted, raising it high. "Maybe it can protect us." The moment I did, a blinding light erupted from the medallion, illuminating the darkness around us. The shadows recoiled, howling in rage, their anguished faces dissolving into the mist. "Keep holding it," Emily urged, her voice barely audible over the chaos. As I concentrated on the light, I felt a connection forming with the trapped souls, their voices intertwining with mine. "You're free," I called out, desperation fueling my resolve. "You don't have to suffer anymore." The light expanded, engulfing the cemetery in its brilliance. The anguished whispers turned to wails of relief as the shadows began to dissipate, dissolving into the night. But just as victory seemed within reach, a dark figure emerged from the mist, a towering entity with hollow eyes that bore into my soul. "You think you can free them?" It boomed, its voice like thunder. "They are mine." A wave of despair washed over me, but I gripped the medallion tighter, determined to stand my ground. "They deserve peace. You have no power over them anymore." The entity roared in fury, reaching out with shadowy tendrils that sought to snatch the medallion from my grasp. I could feel its cold touch against my skin, fear creeping into my mind. "Don't let it take you," Jake shouted, his voice breaking through the chaos. With a surge of courage, I stepped forward, lifting the medallion higher. "I release you," I yelled, my voice echoing across the cemetery. The light exploded, and the entity howled in rage, its form twisting and writhing in agony. The shadows scattered, evaporating like mist in the morning sun, leaving behind only the calm of the night. As the brilliance faded, silence enveloped us. The cemetery lay still, bathed in moonlight, the malevolent presence vanquished. "We did it," Sarah whispered, tears glistening in her eyes. But as we stood there, breathing heavily, I felt an unsettling chill. Is it really over? I asked, glancing around. Before anyone could answer, the ground trembled again, and a fissure opened beneath the grave of Elena Thorne. From it, a low, haunting wail emerged, a final reminder that some spirits may never find peace. Run! I shouted, and we bolted from the cemetery, our hearts pounding as we raced into the safety of the night. But as we reached the campus, I could still feel the weight of the medallion in my pocket, a constant reminder of the darkness we had faced. Somewhere, deep in the shadows, the trapped souls whispered their thanks, but I knew that the curse of the ancient cemetery was far from over. The possession of the old medallion. Have you ever stumbled upon something that felt ordinary at first, only to discover it was anything but? I found an old medallion in my grandmother's attic, nestled between dusty books and yellowing photographs, and it changed my life forever. It was one rainy afternoon in October when I decided to help my grandmother clear out her attic. The musty scent of old wood and forgotten memories enveloped me as I climbed the creaky ladder. My grandmother, a vibrant woman with stories etched into her wrinkles, sat below, urging me to be careful and to watch out for spiders. I smiled at her, reassured, but a strange thrill coursed through me as I unearthed item after item, each holding a fragment of our family's past. Then, I saw it, a small, tarnished medallion glimmering faintly in the dim light. It was heart-shaped, intricately engraved with swirling patterns that seemed to dance across its surface. A sense of curiosity compelled me to pick it up. As soon as my fingers brushed the cool metal, a chill ran down my spine, sending a shiver through me. "What is this, Grandma?" I called down, holding it up for her to see. Her expression shifted, eyes narrowing. "That medallion belonged to your great-grandfather. He always said it had powers." "Powers? Like what?" I laughed lightly, brushing off her words as just another family myth. "Something about it drawing in spirits or demons, or perhaps it was just an old man's tales," she replied, her voice laced with an uneasy air. I chuckled, pocketing the medallion, but a nagging sensation lingered. After finishing our task, I returned home, the medallion weighing heavily in my pocket. As evening fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. I placed it on my nightstand, where it caught the dim glow of my lamp. Despite my earlier bravado, a wave of unease washed over me. I tossed and turned, unable to sleep, glancing at the medallion every now and then. Each time, it seemed to glint in a way that made my heart race. The next morning, I awoke groggy and disoriented. Memories of strange dreams flooded my mind, dreams where shadowy figures whispered to me, their voices a haunting echo in my ears. I dismissed them as mere nightmares, but deep down, I felt an unsettling connection to the medallion. It called to me, as if it held a secret I was meant to uncover. Days turned into weeks, and I found myself inexplicably drawn to the medallion. I wore it constantly, convinced it had a charm, something that brought good luck or maybe even protection. My friends noticed the change in me. "You seem different," they said. "More confident." But it was more than that. I felt alive, invigorated, as if the medallion infused me with a sense of purpose. However, I also noticed subtle shifts in my behavior. I became more irritable, quick to anger over trivial matters. One evening, while out with friends, a minor disagreement spiraled into a full-blown argument. I stormed off, fury coursing through my veins. As I walked home, I clenched the medallion in my fist, its sharp edges digging into my skin. That night, the dreams worsened. I found myself in dark, twisted landscapes, where whispers became screams, and shadows danced just beyond my vision. I woke up gasping, heart pounding, the weight of an unseen presence pressing down on me. It felt as though something was lurking, waiting to seize control. In the days that followed, I became more reclusive. I started isolating myself, retreating into the safety of my home. I often caught glimpses of my reflection in mirrors and windows, but the person looking back seemed different. There was a flicker of something dark in my eyes, a malevolence that made me shudder. One evening, I decided to research the medallion, hoping to find some explanation for my unsettling feelings. I scoured the internet, searching for any mention of it, but I found nothing. Frustrated, I turned to my grandmother. "What do you really know about it?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. She sighed, her face grave. "There are stories, dear. Stories of people who were driven mad by it. You need to be careful. It can attract unspeakable forces." "Unspeakable forces?" "Grandma, that sounds like something from a horror movie." I laughed nervously, but inside, a gnawing fear took root. As I returned home that night, a sense of dread washed over me. I felt as if I were being watched, shadows lurking just beyond my vision. I locked the door behind me, the comforting click echoing in the silence of my home. But as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. It was then that I heard it, a faint whisper, like a breath against my ear. "Come to me." Startled, I shot up, heart racing. The room was still, but the medallion on my nightstand seemed to pulse with an energy of its own. I stared at it, heart pounding, my mind racing. What had I awakened? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing at the precipice of something terrifying, something I had unknowingly invited into my life. As I lay there, staring at the medallion, its intricate patterns appeared to shift in the dim light, forming shapes that danced just out of focus. I could hardly breathe as I wondered, what had I truly unearthed in my grandmother's attic? The whispers continued, soft yet insistent, each one wrapping around my mind like a vine, squeezing tighter. "Come to me." I felt their allure, a seductive promise of power and knowledge just beyond my grasp. Sleep eluded me that night, and I spent hours battling with the urge to reach out and touch the medallion again, to give into its strange pull. The following days blurred together. The vibrant world outside my window felt distant, muffled like an old film. My friends grew concerned, often texting or calling, but I found it hard to respond. I was lost in a haze, a fog thickening around my thoughts. I returned to the attic, driven by an unquenchable thirst for answers. Dust particles floated in the air, catching the light as I rifled through my grandmother's old boxes. I found more items that belonged to my great-grandfather, journals filled with elaborate drawings and scrawled notes about rituals and incantations. They spoke of spirits, of a power that could be harnessed, but at a cost. The deeper I read, the more my pulse quickened. It was as if each word reached out, tugging at the medallion that hung heavy around my neck. As night fell, I returned home with the journal clutched tightly in my hands, a sense of purpose propelling me forward. I knew I had to uncover its secrets, to understand what it all meant. I spent hours poring over the pages, the candlelight flickering as shadows danced on the walls, mimicking the chaotic thoughts racing through my mind. With every sentence, I felt an undeniable connection to my great-grandfather. His words felt alive, resonating within me. I read about the medallion's origins, about how it was forged to bind spirits, to give power to its wearer. But beware, the last entry warned, for the line between power and possession is thin, and the price may be your very soul. I closed the journal, heart racing. What had I done? The medallion felt as if it had come alive, pulsing against my chest, each beat syncing with the frantic rhythm of my heart. I realized then that my transformation had begun. I was not merely a passive observer anymore. I was entwined in something far beyond my comprehension, and it had chosen me. My behavior grew increasingly erratic. Friends commented on my disinterest, my temper flaring over trivial matters. I would find myself staring into mirrors, watching as my reflection distorted, the darkness within me growing ever more pronounced. It was as if a shadow loomed just behind me, always out of sight but never out of mind. I could feel its presence, a companion in the depths of my isolation. One night, as I lay in bed, the whispers returned, louder this time, urging me to embrace what I had found. Unlock your true potential, they coaxed, their voices mingling with my racing thoughts. I felt compelled to respond, a surge of adrenaline coursing through me. I needed to know more. So, I began to experiment, following the cryptic instructions from the journal. I drew sigils on the floor of my bedroom, using chalk to create a circle, a space to contain whatever energies I was summoning. The air grew heavy, thick with anticipation, as I placed the medallion in the center of the circle. I recited the incantations, my voice trembling as I called forth the spirits that my great-grandfather had spoken of. At first, nothing happened. I felt foolish, a child playing with forces I could not understand. But just as I was about to give up, the temperature in the room plummeted. A chill raced through me, and I could see my breath misting in the air. Shadows flickered at the edge of my vision, and I felt an energy swell around me. The medallion began to vibrate, and a surge of power rushed through my veins. "Who dares to summon us?" a voice echoed, low and resonant, sending a thrill of terror down my spine. I stumbled backward, breaking the circle, and the chill dissipated as quickly as it had come. I sat in the darkness, breathless and shaken. Had I truly conjured something? My heart raced as the gravity of what I had attempted settled in. I was in way over my head, yet the thrill of it lingered, a dangerous spark igniting within me. I had touched the edge of a void, and I knew it was only a matter of time before I would reach into its depths once more. Days passed in a blur of confusion and dread. Each night, I found myself haunted by dreams that felt all too real, visions of a dark figure standing at the edge of my bed, its eyes glowing with an unsettling intensity. I would wake, drenched in sweat, heart racing, the shadows of the room feeling more tangible, as if they were alive, shifting and writhing in the corners of my mind. Despite the fear gnawing at my insides, I couldn't deny the allure of the medallion. It had woven itself into the very fabric of my existence. I became obsessed, often staring at it in the mirror, tracing the intricate designs with my fingers, as if expecting it to whisper its secrets directly to me. My friends noticed my erratic behavior, but I brushed off their concerns with a nervous laugh, convinced that I was simply going through a phase. One evening, after a particularly troubling dream, I decided to meet with my closest friend, Jessica. We had always shared everything, but now I felt a wall between us, an invisible barrier forged by my hidden secrets. As we sat at a coffee shop, I tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, but it crumbled when she asked, "What's going on with you? You seem off." I hesitated, the urge to confess rising within me. But the medallion's influence held me back. "I've just been stressed with work and everything," I finally replied, forcing a smile. Jessica studied me, her concern evident. "You know you can talk to me, right? You don't have to go through this alone." A part of me longed to share the truth, the power, the whispers, the shadows, but the other part, the one entwined with the medallion, silenced my voice. I nodded, grateful for our friendship, but felt a rising tide of anger at the thought of being vulnerable. I abruptly changed the subject, steering our conversation to safer waters, but her concerned gaze lingered, and I could feel the distance between us grow. That night, I returned home, the medallion feeling heavier against my chest. I decided to revisit the rituals from the journal, convinced that if I could gain full control over whatever forces I had summoned, I could silence the whispers that plagued me. I cleared a space on the floor, lighting candles that flickered ominously in the darkness. As I settled into my makeshift ritual space, I felt a rush of adrenaline, an intoxicating blend of fear and excitement. I recited the incantations with fervor, the words spilling from my lips like a chant, echoing in the silence of the room. The air thickened, the shadows shifting as if they were responding to my call. And then it happened. A chilling gust of wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles, plunging me into darkness. Panic surged within me as I struggled to breathe, the shadows coalescing into a form, an indistinct figure that loomed before me. "You have called," it whispered, a voice like gravel, scraping against my very soul. I didn't mean to," I stammered, backing away, my heart pounding. The figure stepped closer, the air around it swirling with an unnatural energy. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, the weight of its presence pressing down on me. "Please, I just wanted to understand." "Understanding comes at a cost," it hissed, the words wrapping around me like chains. "What are you willing to sacrifice?" In that moment, I realized I was in over my head. I could feel the medallion pulsing with an energy that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. It beckoned me, urging me to embrace the darkness. I could sense its influence clawing at my mind, filling me with visions of power and control. But in the depths of that dark presence, I saw flashes of my life, my friends, my family, everything I held dear. I couldn't lose myself to this entity, no matter how alluring it seemed. Gathering every ounce of strength, I tore my gaze away from the shadow. "I'm done," I shouted, stumbling backward and breaking the circle I had drawn. The figure recoiled, the shadows dissipating into the corners of my room. The chill lifted, but the fear remained, lingering like a fog. I felt the medallion around my neck grow heavy, as if it were warning me of the consequences I had narrowly escaped. Shaken, I lay in bed, wide awake, my mind racing. The medallion throbbed against my skin, whispering promises of power, but I knew I had to fight it. I couldn't allow it to consume me. But even as I resolved to rid myself of it, a part of me yearned for the power it offered. Over the next few days, I felt the shadowy figure lurking just beyond my periphery, waiting for me to falter. I began to withdraw further, retreating into solitude as paranoia crept in. I avoided Jessica, who had been reaching out with increasing concern. The medallion had become my sole focus, a torment and a treasure all at once. One evening, while scrolling through social media, I came across a post that made my blood run cold, a missing person report for a girl who used to be in my school. She had vanished without a trace, and the last place she was seen was a nearby park that I often visited. The article included a chilling detail. She had been rumored to have been drawn to an old tree where strange happenings were reported. The tree had become a place of urban legend, said to be haunted, a location my great-grandfather mentioned in his journal. A wave of dread washed over me. Had I unwittingly become part of a larger tapestry of darkness? The medallion pulsed against my chest, and I knew I had to go to that tree to confront whatever it was that tied us together. I felt a compulsion, a need to understand the connection between the medallion, the missing girl, and the shadows that haunted my dreams. The sun dipped below the horizon as I made my way to the park, the fading light casting long shadows across the ground. Each step felt heavier, laden with the weight of the medallion around my neck and the gnawing uncertainty in my gut. The missing girl's face haunted me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a trap of my own making. As I approached the old tree, its gnarled branches stretched toward the sky like skeletal fingers, twisting in an unnatural dance. The air was thick with anticipation and electric tension that sent shivers down my spine. I hesitated, the whispers in my mind growing louder, urging me to take that final step. Embrace it, they hissed, unleash the power that lies within you. But the memory of the shadowy figure haunted me. I remembered its words, the price of understanding. I couldn't let the darkness claim me. I had to confront it. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the clearing beneath the tree, the medallion pulsing rhythmically against my chest as if it recognized the gravity of the moment. I reached into my pocket, retrieving the journal. The pages felt warm against my fingers, as if they were alive with the knowledge contained within. I opened it to the last entry, the words blurring before my eyes. I needed to focus. I needed to be strong. "I am here," I called out, my voice trembling but resolute. "Show yourself." The wind howled around me, whipping through the branches and sending leaves swirling into the air. For a moment, nothing happened. Silence enveloped me, broken only by the distant sound of rustling leaves. But then, the shadows at the base of the tree began to coalesce, forming the familiar shape of the dark figure. "You return," it said, its voice echoing through the clearing like a thunderclap. "You seek power, but you do not understand the cost." "I don't want your power," I replied, forcing my voice to remain steady despite the tremor of fear coursing through me. "I want to know the truth. What happened to her?" I pointed at the tree, a knot forming in my stomach as I thought of the missing girl. "The tree is a portal," the figure explained, its form shifting as it moved closer, shadows undulating around it. "It draws in those who seek more than they can comprehend." The girl was curious, just like you. She desired what lies beyond, and now she is lost. A surge of anger flared within me. I refused to believe that. "I can save her. I can find her." The medallion pulsed angrily, and I felt a surge of energy course through me, blurring the line between fear and determination. "Can you?" The figure leaned in, its eyes glowing with an unholy light. "What will you sacrifice to bring her back? Your soul? Your sanity? Are you willing to pay that price?" I hesitated, the weight of its words crashing down on me. I had felt the darkness creeping in, the whispers telling me I could control it, that I could harness its power. But now, standing in the presence of this entity, the consequences loomed larger than ever. "I won't let you take me," I shouted, clenching the journal in my hands. "I will break this cycle." I recited a passage from the journal, words spilling from my lips like a desperate incantation, calling forth the protective energies my great-grandfather had written about. The figure recoiled, the shadows swirling in a chaotic dance around it. "You think you can defy me?" it hissed, but its voice trembled, a hint of fear creeping into its tone. The air crackled with energy, and I could feel the medallion heating against my skin, resonating with the power I was channeling. In that moment of clarity, I understood. The medallion was not just a vessel for darkness, it was also a key to liberation. I focused my energy, picturing the girl, her face filled with life and laughter, and the shadows began to weaken. "I command you to release her." With a final surge, I felt a wave of energy erupt from the medallion, enveloping the clearing in a blinding light. The figure screamed, a sound that echoed through the woods like a death knell as it dissolved into a cascade of shadows. The tree shuddered, branches cracking and snapping as if in protest. I closed my eyes against the brightness, the warmth washing over me, driving away the chill of despair. When I opened them again, the clearing was still, the darkness receding. I stood alone, breathless, the medallion cooling against my chest. But there was no sign of the girl. I had felt a momentary glimmer of hope, but it quickly dimmed. As the light faded, the realization crashed over me. I had defeated the entity, but the price of my defiance was still unknown. Had I really saved her, or had I merely unleashed something far worse? Days turned into weeks, and the shadow of doubt continued to loom over me. I returned to my routine, trying to convince myself that I had done the right thing, that I had freed myself from the grip of the darkness. But the whispers never fully faded. They lingered, faint echoes at the back of my mind, always reminding me of the power I had briefly tasted. Jessica tried to reach out, but I couldn't face her. The distance between us grew, and with it, the shadows deepened around my heart. I still carried the medallion, but its weight felt different now, heavier with the burden of my choices. In the quiet moments before sleep, I would sometimes catch a glimpse of the figure in my reflection, a reminder that darkness was always just a heartbeat away. I had escaped one peril, but I knew the battle was far from over. I would have to confront the shadows within myself before I could ever truly move on. And as I lay in bed each night, the medallion resting on my chest, I wondered, would I ever be free? Or had I merely sown the seeds of a darkness that would grow, consuming everything I held dear? The Ghost Museum. Have you ever felt like something was watching you, even when you were completely alone? I never thought I'd find myself asking such a question while standing in front of the old Museum of the Forgotten. It was a dilapidated building tucked away in a quiet corner of town where the echoes of the past lingered like a heavy fog. The museum had a reputation for being haunted, but that was just a rumor, right? Just a story to scare the kids. Yet, as I looked at the cracked windows and peeling paint, a shiver ran down my spine. It all began one crisp autumn evening when I received an invitation from an old friend, Mark. He was the curator of the museum, and he wanted to share something special with me. It had been years since we last saw each other, and I was eager to reconnect. The prospect of exploring the museum after hours added an air of excitement. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that danced along the cobblestone path leading to the museum. As I stepped inside, the familiar scent of dust and aged wood enveloped me. The air was thick, almost electric, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath in anticipation. Mark greeted me with a wide grin, his enthusiasm infectious. "Welcome. I can't wait to show you what I've been working on," he said, leading me deeper into the museum. The dim light flickered overhead, casting eerie shapes on the walls. Each exhibit seemed to whisper secrets, beckoning me to uncover their stories. "Have you ever thought about what these artifacts have seen?" he asked, gesturing toward a glass case filled with ancient dolls. Their porcelain faces were cracked, and their glassy eyes seemed to follow me as I moved. "I guess they've seen a lot, huh?" I replied, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that crept over me. Mark chuckled. "You have no idea. Some say that when the clock strikes midnight, the exhibits come to life." I laughed, dismissing his words as a joke. But the deeper we ventured into the museum, the more I felt the weight of unseen eyes upon us. The atmosphere shifted, and my heart raced as we approached a section dedicated to local legends and ghost stories. A large tapestry adorned with intricate designs caught my eye. It depicted a scene of ethereal figures dancing in the moonlight, their faces obscured by shadows. "Legend has it that this tapestry is cursed," Mark said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It's said that those who gaze into its threads may find themselves visited by the spirits it portrays." I forced a smile, half convinced it was all just theatrics. Yet, something in my gut twisted uneasily. Mark moved on, oblivious to my apprehension. He seemed invigorated by the atmosphere, his passion for history and the supernatural shining through. We continued our tour, passing through dimly lit rooms filled with relics from centuries past. An old gramophone played a haunting melody, the notes echoing off the walls like a forgotten lullaby. As we paused to admire an ancient mirror, I felt a chill sweep through the room. The reflection showed not just our images, but something darker lurking just beyond the glass. "Did you see that?" I blurted out, my voice barely a whisper. Mark turned to me, eyebrows raised. "See what?" "Never mind." "I must be imagining things," I replied, shaking my head. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. The more time we spent in the museum, the more I felt the pull of the past. It was as if the walls were alive with stories waiting to be told, stories that clawed at the edges of my mind. I could feel the tension building, an electric current running through the air. As we reached the final exhibit, a large wooden door loomed before us, marked restricted access. Curiosity tugged at me, but Mark hesitated. "I shouldn't really show you this," he said, a hint of nervousness creeping into his voice. "Come on, what's behind it?" I pressed, my excitement outweighing his reluctance. He sighed, glancing around as if expecting someone to overhear. "Fine, but you must promise not to tell anyone. It's complicated." With that, he produced a key and unlocked the door, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling down into darkness. The air grew cold as we descended, the light from our flashlights flickering ominously. Each step felt heavier, as if the weight of countless memories bore down upon us. As we reached the bottom, we stepped into a small, dimly lit room filled with dusty crates and cobwebs. In the center stood an old display table, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. My heart raced as I approached, intrigued by the hidden treasures it might hold. Some of these artifacts have been found in places believed to be haunted, Mark explained, his voice low. They're said to hold the essence of the spirits they belong to. I shivered, glancing around the room as an unsettling feeling settled in my chest. I could almost hear the whispers of those who had come before, urging me to leave. But curiosity held me in place, and I reached out to touch an ornate locket resting on the table. The moment my fingers brushed its surface, a jolt of energy surged through me, and the lights flickered violently. Mark shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of echoing laughter that seemed to rise from the very walls. Panic gripped me as I stumbled back, the air thickening with an unshakable dread. The atmosphere shifted dramatically, a sinister presence enveloping us as the laughter faded into an unsettling silence. "What did we just do?" I asked, my voice trembling. Mark's face had gone pale, and I could see the fear etched into his features. "I think we may have awakened something." At that moment, I understood the legends that surrounded the museum. It wasn't just a place of history, it was a threshold to the unknown. As the shadows lengthened and the air grew heavier, I knew we had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. As I stood there, frozen in fear, my mind raced with thoughts of what might happen next. The air in the room seemed to thicken, each breath becoming a struggle against an invisible weight pressing down on me. I glanced at Mark, whose eyes were wide with panic. "What do we do now?" I whispered, my voice barely escaping my throat. He shook his head, fear etched across his face. I don't know. We shouldn't have touched anything. The legends say, they say that once you disturb the relics, the spirits may awaken. The darkness around us deepened, and the flickering lights above us created ominous shadows that danced along the walls. I could feel something in the atmosphere, something watching, waiting. The oppressive silence pressed against my ears, amplifying the sound of my heartbeat. Let's get out of here, I urged, stepping backward, my instincts screaming at me to flee. Mark nodded, and we turned to leave. But as we reached the staircase, an icy breeze rushed past us, slamming the door shut with a deafening bang. My heart dropped into my stomach as we exchanged panicked glances. What just happened? I shouted, the sound echoing in the confined space. I don't know. Mark's voice trembled, his earlier confidence evaporating. It shouldn't have closed like that. The door doesn't even have a lock from this side. Panic surged through me, and I rattled the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse, and an unnatural chill wrapped around us like a vice. My breath quickened as I felt a presence, a weight in the air that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. Stay close, I whispered, trying to summon courage. We need to find another way out. As we moved away from the door, I noticed a small window high up on the wall, its glass dusty and cracked. We can try that. I pointed, desperation flooding my voice. Mark nodded, his face a mask of dread. Help me boost you up. Maybe you can get through. I stepped onto his shoulders, the rough texture of the wall digging into my palms as I reached for the window. Just as my fingers brushed the edge of the glass, I felt a sudden coldness envelop my legs. I gasped, glancing down to see a shadow creeping toward me, dark and shapeless, like ink spilling into water. Mark! I screamed, struggling to maintain my balance as the shadow coiled around my feet. The grip tightened, pulling me down with an insistent force. I've got you, he yelled, his hands grasping my waist as he tried to pull me back. But the shadow was relentless, its icy tendrils snaking up my legs and wrapping around my torso. In a moment of sheer terror, I saw the shadows in the room shift and swirl, forming indistinct shapes that writhed as if they were alive. The whispers returned, echoing around us, a cacophony of voices that rose and fell like a haunting melody. Help! Somebody help us! I cried, my voice rising in panic. Suddenly, the whispers coalesced into one voice, clear and resonant, sending chills through my bones. You disturbed us, and now you shall pay the price. Mark's eyes widened in terror as he pulled me back, but the shadow was strong, and I could feel myself slipping away from him. No, he shouted, panic lacing his voice. The room dimmed further, the shadows stretching and expanding as the voice grew louder, a twisted echo that filled the space. I felt the cold seep deeper into my skin, an unrelenting grip that threatened to pull me into the darkness. Let go of her! Mark shouted, his determination igniting a spark of hope within me. With one final surge of strength, he yanked me back, and I fell to the ground, gasping for breath. The shadow recoiled, retreating just out of reach, its form flickering like a dying flame. We scrambled to our feet, my heart pounding as we faced the door. I could still hear the whispers swirling around us, taunting, beckoning us to surrender. We need to find a way out, now. I urged, glancing around the room for anything that could help. Mark nodded, his face pale but resolute. This way, he pointed toward a dimly lit corner where a small door stood partially ajar. With no time to think, we rushed toward it, the whispers growing louder behind us, echoing our every step. As we approached, I could see that the door led to a narrow hallway, the walls lined with portraits of people long gone. Their eyes seemed to follow us, filled with a knowing sadness that sent another shiver down my spine. I pushed through the door and into the hallway, Mark right behind me. The atmosphere was thick with an eerie energy, each step reverberating with an unsettling resonance. We raced down the corridor, desperately searching for an exit, but the shadows seemed to close in around us, flickering and darting just out of sight. Is it just me, or do those portraits look alive? I whispered, my voice trembling as I stole a glance back at the figures. Their expressions shifted subtly, morphing into haunting smiles that sent chills racing through me. They're just paintings, Mark said, though his voice lacked conviction. As we reached the end of the hallway, we found ourselves in a large room filled with more artifacts, their stories intertwined like threads in a tapestry. A chilling breeze swept through, stirring the dust and causing the exhibits to creak and groan as if they, too, were awakening. What's happening? I asked, my heart racing as I turned to face Mark. His expression was one of sheer panic. I think we're trapped in here, he exclaimed. We need to find the main exit. Before we could make a plan, the door we had just come through slammed shut, sealing us in. The room felt alive, the energy shifting and swirling as the shadows danced around us, whispering tales of sorrow and despair. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me, as if the very walls were closing in. I turned to Mark, searching for reassurance, but the fear in his eyes mirrored my own. We need to stay together, I said, clutching his arm. No matter what happens. As the shadows continued to swirl around us, I felt the air grow heavier, charged with an energy that was both unnerving and suffocating. The artifacts in the room, old mirrors, intricate masks, and dusty dolls, seemed to vibrate with anticipation as if they were part of an ancient ritual. What is this place? I whispered, glancing around at the strange items that filled the room. Each piece appeared to have its own story, yet they were all connected by a thread of unease that bound them together. I don't know, but we need to find a way out before it's too late, Mark replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He stepped cautiously toward a large mirror that stood at the far end of the room, its surface reflecting our anxious faces, but distorting them in unsettling ways. I followed closely, feeling an instinctive pull toward it. Maybe we can use the mirror to see if there's another way out, I suggested, my curiosity piqued despite the overwhelming dread. As I approached, I noticed the reflection began to flicker, the images within the glass warping and shifting. Mark hesitated, his brow furrowing. I don't think that's a good idea, he warned. Mirrors can be gateways to other realms. The legends, they warn against looking too closely. Legends? I replied, feeling a mix of skepticism and intrigue. This is just a mirror, Mark. But even as I spoke, I felt the air around us thrown with energy, a magnetic pull drawing me closer. The whispers grew louder, intertwining with my thoughts, luring me in with promises of secrets and revelations. Look! I exclaimed, pointing at the mirror as images began to materialize. I saw fleeting glimpses of scenes, people in old-fashioned clothing, their faces etched with expressions of sorrow and longing, flickering in and out like an old film reel. Stop! Mark shouted, grabbing my arm. Don't look too long. It's trying to draw you in. But it was too late. I felt myself mesmerized, trapped in the depths of the mirror as I saw a young girl standing alone in a dimly lit room, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. She seemed to be reaching out, her lips moving in silent desperation. Help me! I could almost hear her voice, mingling with the whispers that filled the air. "Please, come back." Mark's voice snapped me back to reality. I blinked rapidly, shaking my head to clear the fog that had settled over my mind. I don't know what happened," I stammered, the image of the girl still lingering in my thoughts. It was as if she was trying to tell me something. "Whatever it is, we can't linger here," he urged, glancing nervously at the mirror. "Let's keep moving." I nodded, though the sense of foreboding only intensified as we turned away from the mirror. The room felt as if it were closing on us, the shadows thickening, whispering darker secrets that wrapped around us like a suffocating blanket. "Look!" Mark suddenly pointed toward a heavy wooden door on the opposite side of the room. "That might be our way out." Together, we rushed toward it, our footsteps echoing ominously on the wooden floor. The door was old and weathered, adorned with intricate carvings that seemed to twist and writhe under the flickering light. I pushed against the door, and it creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled down into darkness. "This has to lead somewhere," I said, my heart racing with a mix of fear and excitement. As we stepped inside, I could feel a chilling draft sweep up from below, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. "Are you sure this is safe?" Mark asked, his voice shaking as he glanced back toward the room we had just left. "We don't have a choice," I replied, my determination solidifying. "We need to find a way out of this nightmare." We descended the staircase, each step echoing ominously in the confined space. The darkness enveloped us, making it hard to see beyond the dim light flickering from a single bulb hanging above. Shadows danced along the walls, creating the illusion of movement, and I felt an unsettling sensation that we were not alone. "Did you hear that?" Mark whispered, halting mid-step. I strained to listen, my heart pounding in my chest. In the silence, I could hear faint whispers, as if 1,000 voices were murmuring just out of reach. "It's probably just the wind," I tried to assure him, but even I felt a deep sense of dread creeping back in. We continued downward, the air growing colder and thicker, until we reached a small, dimly lit chamber at the bottom of the stairs. The walls were lined with more artifacts, but these were different, older, more sinister. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped into the room, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. In the center stood an ornate pedestal on which rested a dusty, intricately carved box. Its surface was adorned with symbols I couldn't recognize, and it pulsed with an almost tangible energy. "What do you think is inside?" Mark asked, stepping closer despite the warning bells ringing in my mind. "I don't know, but I have a bad feeling about this," I said, unease settling in my gut. The box seemed to call out to us, promising secrets long buried. "Should we open it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think we should just leave," I insisted, but my curiosity battled with my instinct to run. As if sensing my hesitation, the box creaked open slightly, a faint glow spilling from within. "No!" I shouted, taking a step back. But it was too late. The moment the box opened fully, a rush of wind whipped through the room, extinguishing the light and plunging us into darkness. I felt a sudden force push against me, and I stumbled, falling to the ground. "Mark!" I cried out, panic rising as I felt the cold air close in around me. "I'm here," he shouted, his voice strained. The darkness felt alive, swirling around us like a storm, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. "You disturbed us," they echoed, a chorus of voices filled with anger and despair. As I scrambled to my feet, I could sense shadows swirling around me, their forms twisting and stretching like grotesque puppets. I grasped for Mark's hand, my heart racing as the whispers grew louder, each one resonating with fear and fury. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, illuminated by a ghostly light. It was the girl from the mirror, her eyes wide with terror. "Help me," she cried, reaching out toward us. "Help me." The girl's voice echoed through the chamber, a haunting plea that filled my heart with dread. Her outstretched hands seemed to reach for us through the swirling shadows, and I could see her features more clearly now, her pale skin, tangled hair, and wide, fearful eyes. "What do we do?" Mark shouted, his voice shaking as he pulled me closer, trying to shield me from the encroaching darkness. "Stay back," I yelled, my own fear bubbling to the surface. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew we were in the middle of something beyond our comprehension. The girl's presence felt both inviting and terrifying. "Help me," she cried again, her voice tinged with desperation. "You have to save me. He won't let me go." The shadows shifted, swirling around her as if alive, pulling her back into the dark. I could see her fighting against the unseen force, but it was as if the darkness had a grip on her that she couldn't break free from. "Who won't let you go?" I asked, my voice trembling. "The one who keeps us trapped here." She glanced over her shoulder, terror etched on her face. "You have to hurry. If he gets you too, you'll never escape." "What are we supposed to do?" Mark's voice was frantic now, and I could feel his fear radiating off him in waves. "Find the key." "It's the only way," the girl urged, her voice wavering as the shadows pulled tighter around her. "You have to hurry. He's coming." Suddenly, a deep, rumbling laugh filled the chamber, vibrating through the walls and sending chills down my spine. The air grew colder, and I could sense an ominous presence drawing closer, filling the room with an aura of malevolence. "No!" I cried, instinctively taking a step toward the girl, but Mark grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "We can't help her," he shouted, panic evident in his voice. "We need to get out." But the girl's eyes locked onto mine, her fear-filled gaze imploring me to understand. "You have to find the key," she pleaded. "It's hidden where the shadows dance the longest." Before I could respond, the darkness erupted around us, shadows coiling like snakes, obscuring everything in their path. The girl's figure began to fade, pulled back into the depths of the dark, her voice fading into a whisper. "Hurry, before it's too late." "Let's go," Mark urged, his grip tightening on my arm as he pulled me away from the pedestal. The oppressive weight of the darkness felt suffocating, the whispers swirling around us like angry spirits. We turned and ran, desperate to escape the chamber. As we climbed the narrow staircase, I glanced back over my shoulder, half expecting to see the girl's face staring back at me from the shadows, but the room was now pitch black, devoid of any light or life. At the top of the stairs, the door slammed shut behind us with a thunderous crash. The sound echoed in my ears, reverberating like a death knell. We stumbled into the main room of the museum, the artifacts around us eerily still, as if they were holding their breath. "What now?" Mark panted, his face pale. "We need to find the key," I replied, my heart racing. The girl said it was hidden where the shadows dance the longest. "Where could that possibly be?" Mark asked, glancing nervously around the room. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my thoughts. "Maybe there's something in this room that can help us," I suggested. We started searching the museum, moving cautiously from one exhibit to the next. Each item felt alive with energy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The tension in the air was palpable, each creak of the floorboards echoing loudly in the silence. Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught my eye. I turned to see a large, ornate mirror against the far wall, its surface shimmering faintly. What if it's connected to the key? I whispered, feeling a rush of hope. Let's check it out, Mark said, his voice filled with determination. We approached the mirror, its surface reflecting not just our images, but a world that seemed to pulse with a strange energy. As I stood before it, I could see shadows moving within, swirling and twisting like smoke. This is where the shadows dance, I murmured, recalling the girl's words. Maybe we can find the key inside. But how do we do that? Mark asked, his brows knitted in concern. Maybe we need to interact with it, I suggested. It could be a portal or a clue. Taking a deep breath, I reached out to touch the cool surface of the mirror. As my fingers made contact, a jolt of energy shot through me, and I felt myself being pulled into the glass. Wait! Mark shouted, but it was too late. The mirror enveloped me, pulling me into a world that was both familiar and strange. I stumbled forward, finding myself in a dimly lit version of the museum, the colors muted and shadows deeper. I could still see the mirror behind me, but it felt distant, a thin barrier between this world and the one I had just left. Mark! I called, but my voice echoed back at me, distorted and faint. In this strange realm, the artifacts were alive, whispering secrets and tales of the past. The atmosphere was thick with energy, and I felt a sense of urgency wash over me. I needed to find the key, to understand what had happened to the girl, and to escape this haunting place. As I wandered through the shadowy exhibits, I noticed a faint glow in the corner of the room. My heart raced as I approached, revealing a small, ornate box similar to the one we had seen earlier. This one, however, was adorned with shimmering symbols that pulsed with light, illuminating the darkness around it. Could this be the key? I reached out cautiously, my fingers brushing against the cool surface of the ornate box. The moment I made contact, a surge of warmth enveloped me, contrasting sharply with the chill that permeated this shadowy realm. The symbols on the box seemed to dance, swirling with life, and I felt an inexplicable connection to it. Please, let this be the key, I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. With a determined breath, I opened the box. Inside, I found a small, intricate key, shimmering with an otherworldly light. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, with delicate carvings that seemed to tell a story of their own. As I lifted the key, the shadows around me flickered, as if responding to its presence. A sense of hope surged within me, but it was quickly overshadowed by the realization that I was still trapped in this eerie version of the museum. Mark! I called out again, hoping he could hear me, but the only response was the echo of my own voice. Suddenly, I heard a faint whisper, barely audible over the low hum of energy in the room. You found it, the voice echoed, both ethereal and familiar. It was the girl's voice, but it sounded different, more fragmented, as if she were both there and not there. Where are you? I cried, looking around frantically. I have the key. We can escape. The shadows twisted and turned, coiling around me like tendrils, pulling me closer to the box. You must use it, the girl's voice urged. But beware, he watches. He will try to stop you. I clenched the key tightly in my hand, feeling its warmth seep into my palm. Who is he? I asked, fear gripping me tightly. An ancient spirit, she replied, her voice trembling with urgency. He feeds on fear, and he will do everything to keep you here. You have to be brave, or you will be lost. A sudden chill swept through the room, and I felt the atmosphere shift. The shadows darkened, growing thicker and more oppressive. I sensed a presence approaching, something sinister lurking just beyond my sight. "Go," the girl urged. "You must find the door. It's the only way to escape." With her words echoing in my mind, I glanced around, searching for an exit. The mirror was still behind me, but it felt like a barrier rather than a pathway. I couldn't turn back. I had to push forward. "Where is the door?" I whispered, scanning the room for any signs of escape. The walls seemed to shift and change, obscuring the path ahead, but I could feel the energy guiding me toward a flickering light in the distance. Ignoring the mounting dread, I sprinted toward it, the shadows clawing at my heels. The whispers intensified, swirling around me like a storm, urging me to slow down, to turn back. "You'll never leave," they taunted, their voices mingling into a cacophony of despair. I pushed through the darkness, my heart racing. As I approached the flickering light, I saw it, the door, standing ajar, beckoning me to escape. But just as I reached for the handle, a deep, rumbling voice filled the air, sending a wave of terror crashing over me. "Who dares enter my domain?" it boomed, the very ground beneath me trembling. I hesitated, paralyzed by fear. The shadows shifted ominously, swirling around the door, blocking my escape. "I must go," I shouted defiantly, clutching the key tightly in my fist. "I won't let you keep me here." "Foolish child," the voice sneered. "You think you can defy me? I am the darkness that consumes your very soul." With a burst of adrenaline, I plunged the key into the door's lock. It fit perfectly, as if it were always meant to be there. I turned it, and with a loud click, the door creaked open, revealing a blinding light that contrasted starkly with the shadows around me. The presence roared in fury, the shadows convulsing violently as I stepped through the threshold. I felt a pull, a sensation of being torn between worlds, and just as the darkness lunged forward, I crossed into the light. The world spun around me, and I stumbled, landing on the cool wooden floor of the museum's main hall. The air was thick with silence, and for a moment, I believed I was safe. But then I looked up and froze. The exhibits were all back in their places, the artifacts quiet and still. I was alone. "Mark?" I called out, my voice trembling with uncertainty. There was no response. "Mark!" I shouted again, panic flooding my veins. "Where are you?" As I got to my feet, I scanned the room for any sign of him. The eerie stillness was unsettling, and I could feel a familiar chill creeping back into my bones. Suddenly, I heard a faint sound, a whispering, echoing from the far end of the hall. My heart raced as I moved cautiously toward it, my senses heightened. The shadows seemed to dance along the walls, twisting and curling, filling me with dread. "Mark?" I called hesitantly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Help," came the faint response, distorted and weak. I rushed toward the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. As I approached, I saw a figure slumped against the wall, a dark silhouette, shrouded in shadows. "Mark!" I cried, rushing forward. But as I reached him, I froze in horror. The figure was not him. It was an eerie reflection of him, a twisted version caught in the throes of despair, its eyes hollow and soulless. "No!" I whispered, the realization sinking in. "What have you done to him?" The shadows began to swirl around me again, and I could hear the laughter, deep and mocking, echoing through the hall. The darkness was closing in, and I felt the cold grip of fear wrapping around my heart once more. "Welcome back," the voice echoed, the very air heavy with malice. "You thought you could escape, but this is my realm, and you are mine. As the shadows constricted around me, I struggled to breathe, my mind racing with desperate thoughts. The malevolent presence loomed closer, its laughter reverberating like a dark symphony through the museum. I realized I had to act quickly. I couldn't allow the darkness to consume me or Mark. Get away from him! I screamed, summoning every ounce of courage I had left. The twisted version of Mark remained silent, its hollow eyes staring into mine as if pleading for help even in its corrupted state. The dark voice echoed, "You believe you can save him? You cannot save those who are already lost." Mark! I cried again, my voice piercing the suffocating air. I felt the key in my pocket, its presence a small but reassuring warmth against the coldness of my fear. I won't give up on you. Summoning the strength from within, I plunged my hand into my pocket and grasped the key tightly. I focused on the memories of Mark, his laughter, our adventures, and the warmth of his presence. Each thought became a lifeline, a tether to reality, igniting a flicker of hope amidst the overwhelming darkness. "Come on, Mark!" I shouted, desperation lacing my voice. "Fight it! You're stronger than this." For a brief moment, the hollow figure of Mark flickered, a hint of recognition flashing in its eyes. "Help me," it whispered, the sound barely audible over the encroaching shadows. I felt the darkness recoil slightly, as if my words had a tangible effect. "I have the key!" I shouted, feeling the energy surge around me. "And I know how to use it." With a deep breath, I focused on the door I had just escaped through. The key was more than just a physical object, it was a symbol of hope, of liberation. I had to use it to free Mark and break the hold of the darkness. I moved closer to the corrupted figure, the shadows swirling furiously around us. "This is not you, Mark," I declared, thrusting the key toward him, willing him to remember who he truly was. "You're not part of this darkness." "Release him," the voice hissed, the shadows writhing in fury. "He belongs to me now." "No!" I shouted defiantly, thrusting the key closer. "You don't own him. You're nothing but a lie." With those words, I inserted the key into the heart of the shadows surrounding Mark. The air crackled with energy as a brilliant light exploded from the key, illuminating the room with a blinding radiance that forced the darkness to recede. "Mark!" I yelled, watching as the light engulfed him. The twisted figure began to shimmer, the shadows peeling away like the layers of an onion. His eyes, once hollow, flickered with life and recognition. "Jenny," he cried, his voice breaking through the murky veil. "I'm here." With one final surge of energy, I pulled the key free, and the darkness howled in rage. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I saw Mark begin to regain his form, the shadows lifting to reveal the man I loved, desperate and confused, but undeniably alive. "Let's get out of here," I urged, grabbing his hand. Together, we dashed toward the open door, the blinding light guiding us like a beacon of hope. But as we reached the threshold, the malevolent voice roared one last time, shaking the very foundation of the museum. "You may escape today, but I will always be watching. You cannot hide from me." We burst through the door, the light consuming us as we crossed the threshold back into the real world. The museum returned to its familiar stillness, the shadows retreating into the corners like whispers lost to time. Gasping for breath, I looked around, my heart racing. We were back in the main hall, surrounded by the familiar artifacts, but something felt different. There was a heavy silence that pressed down on us, a lingering reminder of the darkness we had just escaped. Did we really make it? Mark asked, his voice trembling. "I think so," I replied, looking around. "But we need to leave. Now." As we rushed toward the exit, I felt a chill run down my spine. I glanced back at the exhibits, my pulse quickening. The artifacts were still, yet I could feel a lingering gaze upon us, an unshakable sense of being watched. "Did you hear that?" Mark whispered, pausing for a moment. I nodded, fear creeping back in. It was the sound of soft whispers, echoing from the depths of the museum. They wrapped around us like a shroud, pulling our thoughts, reminding us of the darkness we had narrowly escaped. "Let's keep moving," I urged, my heart racing. But as we reached the door, a mirror hanging on the wall caught my eye, reflecting our frantic expressions. In its surface, I saw a flicker, a shadow darting behind us. I turned sharply, but nothing was there. "Jenny!" Mark called, his voice laced with urgency. "We need to go." I turned back toward him, but just as I did, the whispers grew louder, drowning out my thoughts. "You will never escape. You will always belong to the shadows." The world around us began to blur, the museum's exit distorting into a haze. My heart raced as I realized we might not be free after all. "Hold on to me," I shouted, grasping Mark's hand tightly. As we stepped through the door, the whispers intensified, merging into a haunting melody that echoed in my mind. The sensation of being pulled backward was overwhelming, and I could feel the shadows reaching for us, clawing at my very soul. But then, in that moment of chaos, I remembered the key. The warmth of its presence surged within me, reminding me of our fight, of our determination to break free. "We will not be yours," I screamed into the darkness. And with that declaration, the light engulfed us once more, pulling us into its warm embrace, the shadows screaming in fury as we finally crossed into the world of the living. We landed on the grass outside the museum, gasping for air, the sun shining brightly above us. I blinked against the light, disoriented but alive. "Did we do it?" Mark asked, his voice hoarse. "I think so," I replied, glancing around. The museum loomed behind us, quiet and still, but the shadows felt distant now, fading into the corners of my mind. As we stood there, the weight of our experience pressed down upon us. The sunlight felt warm against my skin, yet the chill of the museum lingered like a ghostly reminder of what we had faced. But as we turned to leave, I felt a nagging sensation, an unease that refused to fade. I looked back at the museum, a sense of dread creeping into my heart. The front doors were wide open, and as I watched, I saw a flicker of movement just beyond the entrance. A shadow darted inside, disappearing into the depths of the building. "Let's go," Mark urged, sensing my hesitation. But I couldn't shake the feeling that our battle was far from over. "Wait," I said, gripping his arm. "Do you see that?" He turned, but whatever I had glimpsed was gone. "It's just the museum," he said softly, pulling me away. We made it out. But as we walked away, I could still feel the echoes of the whispers haunting me. "You will never escape." And deep down, I knew that even if we had left the museum, the shadows would always linger in the corners of our lives, waiting for the moment to rise again. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.